Part 3. Mallorea. Chapter 19. They remained for nearly a week in the imperial compound as the personal guests of Emperor Zakath, who, for some strange reason, seemed to take a melancholy pleasure in their company. Quarters were provided for them within the labyrinth of silken tents and pavilions that sheltered Zakath's household staff, and their every comfort received the personal attention of the Emperor himself. The strange, sad-eyed man puzzled Princess Tinedra. Although he was the absolute soul of courtesy, the memory of his interview with King Gethel frightened her. His ruthlessness was all the more chilling because he never lost his temper. He never seemed to sleep either, and when, often in the middle of the night, he felt some obscure need for conversation, he would send for Tinedra. He never apologized for having interrupted her rest. It apparently did not even occur to him that his summons might in some way inconvenience her.
"Where did King Rodar receive his military training?"
Zakath asked her during one of these midnight interviews.
"None of my information about him even hints about any such talents."
The Emperor was seated deep in the purple cushions of a soft chair, with golden candlelight playing over his face and his cat dozing in his lap.
"I really could not say, Your Majesty,"
Tinedra replied, toying absently with the sleeve of the pale silk gown that had been provided for her soon after her arrival.
"I only met Rodar last winter."
"Very peculiar," Zakath mused. "We had always assumed that he was just a foolish old man doting on his young wife. We had never even considered him a possible threat. We concentrated our attentions on Brand and Anheg. Brand is too self-effacing to be a good leader, and Anheg seemed too erratic to give us much concern. Then Rodar appeared out of nowhere to take charge of things. The Alorns are an enigma, aren't they? How can a sensible Tonedran girl stand them?"
She smiled briefly.
"They do have a certain charm, Your Majesty,"
she told him rather pertly.
"Where is Belgariad?"
The question came without any warning.
"We don't know, Your Majesty,"
Tinedra answered evasively.
"Lady Belgariad was furious when he slipped away."
"In the company of Belgarath and Keldar,"
the Emperor added.
"We heard of the search for them. Tell me, Princess, does he by any chance have Kragyaska with him?"
"Kragyaska?"
"The burning stone. What you in the West call the Orb of Aldur."
"I'm not at liberty to discuss that, Your Majesty,"
she told him rather primly.
"And I am sure that you are too courteous to try to wring the information out of me."
"Princess,"
he said reprovingly.
"I am sorry, Your Majesty,"
she apologized, and gave him that quick little girl smile that was always her weapon of last resort. Zakath smiled gently.
"You are a devious young woman, Tinedra."
"Yes, Your Majesty,"
she acknowledged.
"What prompted you and Tar Ogas to bury your enmity and unite against us?"
Tinedra wanted to demonstrate that she too could ask surprise questions.
"There was no unity in our attack, Princess. I was merely responding to Tar Ogas."
"I don't understand."
"So long as he remained at Rakgaska, I was perfectly content to stay at Tulzelik. But as soon as he began to march north, I had to respond. The land of the Tulls is of too much strategic importance to allow it to be occupied by a hostile force."
"And so what now, Zakath?"
Tinedra asked him impudently.
"Tar Ogas is dead. Where will you turn now in search of an enemy.
He smiled a wintry smile.
How little you understand us, Tinedra. Tar Ogas was only the symbol of Mogo fanaticism. Tuchik is dead, and Tar Ogas is dead. But Morgodom lives on, even as Mallorea will live on when I am gone. Our enmity goes back for aeons. At least, however, a Mallorean emperor is in a position to crush Cthulhu Morgos once and for all, and to make himself undisputed over-king of Engarak.
It is all for power, then?
What else is there?
He asked her sadly.
When I was very young, I thought there might be something else. But events proved that I was wrong.
A brief look of pain crossed his face, and he sighed.
In time, you will discover that same truth. Your Belgariad will grow colder as the years pass, and the chill satisfaction of power comes more and more to possess him. When it is complete, and only his love of power remains, then he and I will move against each other, as inevitably as two great tides. I will not attack him until his education is complete. There is no satisfaction in destroying a man who does not fully comprehend reality. When all of his illusions are gone, and only his love of power remains, then will he be a fit opponent.
His face had grown bleak. He looked at her, his eyes as dead and as cold as ice.
I think I have kept you from your rest too long, Princess. Go to bed. Dream of love and other absurdities. The dreams will die all too soon, so enjoy them while you can.
Early the next morning, Tinedra entered the pavilion where Polgara rested, recuperating from the struggle with the Grolums at Tulmardo. She was alert, but still dreadfully weak.
He is every bit as insane as Tar Urgos was,
Tinedra reported.
He is so obsessed with the idea of becoming over-king of Engarak that he is not even paying any attention to what we've been doing.
That may change once Anheg starts sinking his troop ships. There is nothing we can do at the moment, so just keep listening to him and be polite.
Do you think we should try to escape?
No. Tinedra looked at her, a bit startled. What's happening is supposed to happen. There is some reason that the four of us, you, Dernick, Erend, and I, are supposed to go to Mallorea. Let's not tamper with it.
You knew this was going to happen?
Polgara gave her a weary smile. I knew that's where we were going. I did not know how exactly. Zakath is not interfering in any way, so do not aggravate him. Tinedra sighed in resignation.
Oh, whatever you say, Lady Polgara.
It was early afternoon of that same day when the first reports of King Anheg's activities in the Sea of the East reached the Emperor Zakath. Tinedra, who was present when the dispatches were delivered, felt a secret sense of satisfaction as the icy man showed the first hint of irritation she had seen in him.
Are you certain of this?
He demanded of the trembling messenger, holding up the parchment.
I only carried the dispatch, Dreadlord.
The messenger quailed, cringing back from his emperor's anger.
Were you at Tolzelek when the ships arrived? There was only one ship, Dreadlord. One ship, out of 50.
Zakath's tone was incredulous.
Weren't there others, perhaps coming along the coast? The sailor said that there were not, Your Imperial Majesty. What kind of barbarian is this Anheg of Karak?
Zakath exclaimed to Tinedra.
Each of those ships carried 200 men.
King Anheg is in Alon, your majesty,
Tinedra replied coolly.
They are an unpredictable people.
With a great deal of effort, Zakath regained his composure.
I see,
he said after a moment's reflection.
This was your plan from the beginning, wasn't it, Princess? The entire attack on Tulmado was a subterfuge.
Not entirely, your majesty. I was assured that the city had to be neutralized to permit the passage of the fleet.
But why is he drowning my soldiers? I bear the Elons no malice.
Torak does, or so I am told, and it is Torak who will command the combined armies of Engerak. We cannot allow your forces to land on this continent, your majesty. We cannot give Torak that advantage.
Torak is asleep, and he is likely to remain so for a number of years yet.
Our information indicates that it won't be nearly so long. Belgariad himself is convinced that the time is near at hand.
His eyes narrowed slightly.
I must hand you all over to the Grolums, then. I had hoped to wait until Polagra had regained her strength before subjecting her to the journey. But if what you say is true, there is little time to waste. Advise your friends to make their preparations, Princess. You will depart for Tulzelek tomorrow morning.
As your majesty wishes,
Tinedra replied, a chill going down her spine as she bowed her head in acquiescence.
I'm a secular man, Princess, he said by way of explanation. I bow to the altar of Torak when the occasion demands it. But I make no pretense at excessive piety. I will not involve myself in a religious dispute between Belgarath and Zedar, and I most certainly will not stand between Torak and Ardur when they confront each other. I would strongly advise you to follow the same course.
The decision is not mine to make, your majesty. My part in this was decided for me long before I was born.
He looked amused.
The prophecy, you mean? We Angaraks have one also, Princess, and I do not imagine yours is any more reliable than ours. Prophecy is no more than a trick of the priesthood to maintain its grip on the gullible.
Then you believe in nothing, my lord?
I believe in my own power. Nothing else makes any sense.
The Grolums, who escorted them in easy stages northward across the summer-browned plains of Mishrek Akhtal toward Tulzelek, were coldly proper. Tinedra could not be sure if their behavior was the result of warnings from the Emperor of Mallorea, or their fear of Polgara. The stifling heat was past now, and the air smelled faintly of the dusty end of summer. The Tullish plain was dotted with villages, random collections of thatch-roofed cottages and dirt streets. The villagers watched, sullen and afraid, as the priests of Torak rode through the little towns, their faces cold and aloof. The plain to the west of Tulzelek was covered with the red tents of the vast staging area that had been erected for the Mallorean army. With the exception of caretaker detachments, however, the huge camp was empty. The troops already in Mishrak Akhtul were with Zakath near Tulmardu, and the steady stream of new arrivals had been quite suddenly cut off. Tulzelek itself was like any port town in the world, smelling of salt water, fish, tar, and rotting seaweed. The gray stone buildings were low and squat, almost like the Tulls themselves, and the cobblestone streets all sloped down toward the harbor, which lay in the curve of a broad estuary, and faced a somewhat similar harbor on the other side.
"What city is that?"
Tinedra curiously asked of one of the Grolums, as she looked across the dirty water toward the far shore.
Yarmarak,
the black-robed priest answered curtly.
"Ah,"
she said, remembering now her tedious geography lessons. The two cities, one Tulish, the other Nadrak, faced each other across the estuary at the mouth of the river Cordu, and the boundary between Mishrak Akhtal and Garag Nadrak ran down the precise center of the river.
When the Emperor returns from Tulmadu, I imagine that he will take steps to eradicate that place over there, one of the Grolums added. He was not pleased with the behavior of the King of Drosta on the battlefield, and some chastisement seems to be in order.
They proceeded directly down a cobbled avenue to the harbor, where but a few ships were moored to the wharves.
My crew absolutely refuses to put to sea,
the Mallorean captain of the ship upon which they were to embark reported to the Grolums.
The Carricks out there are like a pack of wolves, burning and sinking everything afloat. The Carrick fleet is farther south,
the priest in charge of the detachment of Grolums declared.
The Carrick fleet is everywhere, revered priest,
the captain disagreed.
2 days ago they burned 4 coastal towns, 200 leagues to the south of here, and yesterday they sank 12 ships 100 leagues to the north. You would not believe how fast they can move. They do not even take the time to loot the towns that they are burning.
He shuddered.
They are not men. They are a natural disaster. We will set sail within the hour, the Grolum insisted. Not unless your priests know how to man the oars and handle the rigging, the captain told him. My men are terrified. They won't sail. We will convince them, the Grolum said darkly.
He gave a few orders to his under-priests. An altar was quickly erected on the high stern deck, and a brazier filled with glowing coals placed to one side of it. The leader of the Grolums took his place at the altar and began chanting in a deep, hollow voice, his arms raised to the sky. In his right hand he held a gleaming knife. At random, his cohorts selected a sailor and dragged him, screaming and struggling, to the stern deck. As Cenedra watched with horror, he was bent backward across the altar and butchered with an almost casual efficiency. The Grolum who had wielded the knife lifted the dead man's dripping heart.
"Behold our offering, dragon god of Angarak!" he cried in a great voice, then turned and deposited the heart in the smoking brazier. The heart steamed and sizzled horribly for a moment, then began to blacken and shrivel as the fire consumed it. From the bow of the ship a gong clanged in iron celebration of the sacrifice. The Grolum, at the altar, his bloody hands dripping, turned to confront the ashen-faced sailors crowded amidships. "Our ceremonies will continue until the ship sails," he told them. "Who will be the next to give his heart to our beloved god?"
The ship set sail immediately. Tenedra, sick with revulsion, turned her face away. She looked at Polgara, whose eyes burned with hatred, and who seemed in the grip of an overpowering interior struggle. Tenedra knew her, and she knew that it was only by a tremendous effort of her will that Polgara was able to keep herself from unleashing a terrible retribution on the blood-stained Grolum at the altar. Beside her, protected in the clasp of one of her arms, stood Errand. On the child's face was an expression Cenedra had never seen there before. His look was sad, compassionate, and, at the same time, filled with a kind of iron-hard resolution, as if, had he but the power, he would destroy every altar to Torak in all the world.
"You will go below decks now?" one of their Grolum captors told them. "It will be a matter of some days before we reach the shores of boundless Mallorea."
They sailed north, hugging the Nadrak coastline, fearfully ready to run for any beach that offered itself should Carrick ships appear on the horizon. At a certain point, The Mallorean captain peered about at the empty sea, swallowed hard, and swung his tiller over for the quick, terrified dash across open water to the east. Once, a day or more out from the Nadrak coast, they saw a dreadful column of thick black smoke rising far to the south, and a day or so farther on they sailed through a sea littered with charred debris, where bodies, pale and bloated, bobbed in the dark waves of the eastern sea. The frightened sailors pulled their oars with all their strength, not even needing the encouragement of whips to row faster. Then, one murky morning, when the sky behind them threatened rain squalls, and the air was oppressively heavy with the advancing storm, a low, dark smudge appeared on the horizon ahead of them, and the sailors doubled their efforts, rushing desperately toward the safety of the Mallorean coast ahead. The beach upon which the small boats from their ship landed them was a sloping shingle of dark, salt-encrusted gravel, where the waves made a strange, mournful sighing as they receded. Awaiting them some distance up from the water's edge sat a mounted party of Grolums, their black robes belted at the waist with crimson sashes.
"Archpriests," Polgara noted coldly. "We are to be escorted with some ceremony, I take it."
The Grolum who had commanded their escort went quickly up the gravel stand toward the waiting group and prostrated himself before them, speaking with a hushed reverence. One of the archpriests, an aged man with deeply lined face and sunken eyes, dismounted rather stiffly and came down to where Tsenedra and her friends had just stepped from the small boat.
"My queen?"
he said to Polgara, bowing respectfully.
"I am Ertag, Archpriest of the district of Kamat. I am here with my brethren to escort you to the City of Night."
"I'm disappointed not to find Zadar waiting," the sorceress replied coldly. "I trust that he's not indisposed." Ertag gave her a quick look of irritation.
"Do not rail against your foreordained fate, Queen of Angarak," he advised her.
"I have two fates awaiting me, Ertag. Which one I will follow has not yet been decided."
"I do not have any doubts about the matter," he declared.
"That's probably because you have never dared to look at the alternatives," she replied. "Shall we go, Ertag? A windy beach is hardly the place for philosophical discussion." The Grolum archpriests had brought horses with them, and the party was soon mounted and riding away from the sea, across a line of low wooded hills in a generally northeasterly direction. The trees bordering the upper edge of the gravel beach had been dark-boughed spruces, but once they topped the first rise, they entered a vast forest of white-barked aspens. To Tsenedra's eyes, the stark white trunks looked almost corpse-like, and the entire forest had a gloomy, unhealthy quality about it.
"Mistress Paul,"
Durnick said in a voice that was scarcely more than a whisper,
"shouldn't we be working on some kind of plan?"
"For what, Durnick?"
"For our escape, of course."
"But we don't want to escape, Durnick."
"We don't?"
"The Grolums are taking us to the place we want to go."
"Why do we want to go to this Tol Mishrek of theirs, then?"
"We have something to do there."
"From everything I've heard, it's a bad sort of place," he told her. "Are you sure you haven't made some mistake?"
She reached out and laid her hand on his arm. "Dear Durnick, you will just have to trust me."
"Of course, Mistress Paul," he replied immediately. "But shouldn't I know what to expect? If I should have to take steps to protect you, I ought to be prepared."
"I'd tell you if I knew, Durnick, but I don't know what we should expect. All I know is that the four of us are supposed to go to Tol Mishrek. What's going to happen there needs us in order for it to be complete. Each of us has something to do there."
"Even me?"
"Especially you, Durnick. At first I did not understand who you really are. That's why I tried to keep you from coming along, but now I do understand. You have to be there because you are going to do the one thing that's going to turn the entire outcome one way or the other."
"What is it?"
"We don't know." His eyes grew wide.
"What if I did it wrong?" he asked in a worried voice.
"I don't think you can," she assured him. "From everything I understand, what you are going to do will flow very naturally out of who and what you are." She gave him a brief, wry little smile. "You won't be able to do it wrong, Dernek, any more than you would be able to lie or cheat or steal. It's built into you to do it right. So don't worry about it."
"Well, it's all very well for you to say, Mistress Paul," he replied. "But if you don't mind, I will worry about it just a little bit, privately, of course."
She laughed then, a little, a fond little laugh. "You dear, dear man," she said impulsively, taking his hand. "Whatever would we do without you?" Dernek blushed and tried to look away, but her glorious eyes held his, and he blushed even more. After they had passed through the forest of aspen, they entered a strangely desolate landscape. White boulders stuck up out of tangled weeds like tombstones in a long-abandoned graveyard, and dead trees thrust their crooked limbs at the overcast sky like pleading fingers. The horizon ahead was covered with a bank of darker cloud, a cloud so intensely black that it seemed almost purple. Oddly, Thenedra noted, the cloud bank did not seem to be moving at all. There was no sign anywhere of any human habitation, and the route they followed was not even marked by a trail.
"Does no one live there?"
the princess asked Polgara.
"Tol Mishrak is deserted,
except for a few Grolams," the sorceress replied. "Torak smashed the city and drove its people out the day my father and King Kerak and his sons stole the orb back from the Iron Tower."
"When was that?"
"A very long time ago, Thenedra. As nearly as we have been able to determine, it was precisely on the same day that Belgariad and I were born, and the day our mother died. It's a bit hard to say for sure. We were a bit casual about keeping track of time in those days."
"If your mother had died and Belgarath was here, well, who took care of you?"
"Belden, of course." Polgara smiled. "Oh, he wasn't a very good mother, but he did the best that he could until father returned."
"Is that why you're so fond of him?"
"One of the reasons, yes." The ominous cloud bank still did not move. It stretched across the sky as stationary as a range of mountains. As they rode toward it, it loomed higher and higher.
"That's a very strange cloud,"
Dernek noted, looking speculatively at the thick curtain of purple ahead.
"The storm's coming in behind us. That cloud doesn't seem to be moving at all."
"It does not move, Dernek. It never has moved. When the Engaraks built Tol Mishrak, Torak put that cloud there to hide the city. It has been there ever since."
"How long's that?"
"About 5,000 years.
"The sun never shines there?"
"Never." The Grolam archpriest had begun to look about with a certain apprehension, and finally Urtag called a halt.
"We must make ourselves known," he declared. "We do not want the Watchers to mistake us for intruders."
The other archpriests nodded nervously, and then all removed polished steel masks from beneath their robes and carefully covered their faces with them. Then each of them untied a thick torch from his saddle and ignited it with a brief, mumbled incantation. The torches burned with a peculiarly green-tinged flame and gave off a reeking sulphurous smoke. "I wonder what would happen if I were to blow out your torches," Polgara suggested, with a hint of mischievous smile on her face. "I could, you know." Urtag gave her a worried look.
"This is no time for foolishness, my lady," he warned her. "The Watchers are very savage with intruders. Our lives depend on these torches. Please, Don't do anything to bring down a disaster on us all."
She laughed lightly, and let it go at that. As they rode in beneath the cloud, it grew steadily darker. It was not precisely the clean darkness of night, but was rather a kind of dirty murkiness, a deep shade hovering in the air. They crested a rise, and saw before them a cloud-enshrouded basin, and in its center, half obscured by the pervasive gloom, stood the ravaged city of night. The vegetation around them had shrunk to a few sparse weeds, and an unhealthy-looking stunted grass, pale and sick for want of sun. The boulders thrusting up out of the earth were splotched with a sort of leprous lichen that ate into the rock itself, and nodules of a white fungus lumped in grotesque profusion, spreading out across the dank soil as if the ground itself were diseased. With a slow, careful pace, their sputtering torches held above their heads, the Grolem archpriests led the way down into the gloomy basin, and across the unwholesome plain toward the shattered walls of Xalmishrek. As they entered the city, the princess saw furtive hints of movement among the tumbled stones. Shadowy forms scurried from place to place among the ruins, and the sound of their movements was the clicking scrape made by creatures whose feet were clawed. Some of the shapes were upright, others were not. Tsinedra grew cold and afraid. The watchers of Xalmishrek were neither beast nor human, and they seemed to exude a kind of indiscriminate malice toward all other living things. More than anything, she was afraid that one of them might suddenly turn and confront her with a face that might rip away her sanity by its hideousness. As they passed down a broken street, Urtag began to intone an ancient prayer to Torak, his voice hollow and shaking. The dank air grew colder, and the disease-like lichen ate at the tumbled stones of the ruined houses. Mold seemed to cling to everything, and the pale fungus grew in grotesque lumps in corners and crannies. The smell of decay was everywhere. A damp, rotten stench, and slimy pools of stagnant water lay among the ruins. In the center of the city stood the rusted stump of a vast iron tower, the broken-off girders which had supported it thicker than a man's waist. Just to the south of the stump lay a broad, rusted trail of total destruction where the tower had fallen, crushing everything beneath it. Over the aeons, the iron had rusted down into a sort of damp red mud that outlined the enormous dimensions of the fallen structure. The stump had eroded down, the years rounding off the corners and broken edges. The rust mingled in places with a kind of thick black ooze that ran down the faces of the iron plates like gobbets of clotted blood. Urtag, trembling visibly now, dismounted before a vast arched portal and led them through a half-open iron door. The echoing chamber they entered was as large as the imperial throne room in Tolhanath. Wordlessly, his torch held high over his head, Urtag led them across the pitted floor to another iron-arched doorway, and then down a flight of clanging iron steps that reached into the darkness beneath. At the bottom of the stairs, perhaps 50 feet below the wreckage above, stood another door of black iron, studded with great round rivet heads. Hesitantly, Urtag rapped his knuckles on the door, and the sound of his rapping echoed hollowly in the chamber beyond.
"Who comes to disturb the slumber of the dragon god of Engerak?"
a muffled voice demanded from behind the door.
"I am Urtag, the archpriest of Kamat."
The Grolem's voice was frightened now.
"As commanded, I bring the prisoners to the disciple of Torak."
There was a moment of silence, then the rattling sound of an immense chain, followed by the grating of an enormous bolt. Then, slowly, creakingly, the door opened. Tsinedra gasped. Standing in the doorway was Belgarath. It was a moment before her startled eyes began to sort out the subtle differences that informed her that the white-haired man before her was not indeed the old sorcerer, but rather someone who looked so much like him that they could easily pass for brothers. Subtle though the differences were, they were the nonetheless profound. In the eyes of the man in the doorway there was a haunted look, a look compounded of grief and horror, and a dreadful self-loathing, all overlaid with the helpless adoration of a man who has given himself utterly to a dreadful master.
"Welcome to the tomb of the one-eyed god, Pogala,"
he greeted the sorceress. "It has been a long time, Belzedar," she replied in an oddly neutral voice.
"I have given up the right to that name,"
he told her, and his tone was faintly regretful. "It was your decision, Zedar?" He shrugged.
Perhaps not. Maybe what I'm doing is also necessary."
He pushed the door open wider.
"Come inside, if you will. This crypt is habitable, if only barely."
He looked directly at Urtag then.
"You have performed a service, Urtag, Archpriest of Torak, and a service should not be unrewarded. Come."
And he turned and led them back into the vaulted chamber beyond. The walls were of stone, massive blocks set without mortar, and bolted to the topmost tier were great iron arches supporting the ceiling and the immense ruin above them. The great chill of masses of cold stone and iron was held off by large glowing braziers set in each corner. In the center of the room stood a table and several chairs, and along one wall lay a cluster of loosely rolled pallets and a neat stack of gray woolen blankets. On the table stood a pair of large candles, their flame unwinking, steady in the dead air of the tomb. Zedar paused briefly at the table to pick up one of the candles, then led them across the flagstone floor to an arched alcove set in the far wall.
"Your reward, Urtag," he said to the Grolem. "Come, behold the face of your god."
He lifted the candle. Lying upon its back on a stone bier, within the alcove, lay a huge figure, robed and cowled in black. The face was concealed by a polished steel mask. The eyes of the mask were closed. Urtag took one terrified look, then prostrated himself on the floor. There was a deep, rasping sigh, and the recumbent figure in the alcove moved slightly. As Tzenedra stared in horrified fascination, the vast, steel-covered face turned restlessly toward them. For a moment, the polished left eyelid opened. Behind that eyelid burned the dreadful fire of the eye that was not. The steel face moved as if it were flesh, twisting into an expression of contempt at the priest groveling on the flagstones, and a hollow murmuring came from behind the polished lips. Urtag started violently, and raised his suddenly stricken face, listening to the hollow muttering which he alone in the dim crypt could hear clearly. The hollow voice continued, murmuring in Urtag's ears. The archpriest's face drained as he listened, and a look of unspeakable horror slowly twisted his features. The hollow muttering droned on. The words were indistinct, but the inflections were not. Desperately, Tzenedra covered her ears. Finally, Urtag screamed and scrambled to his feet. His face had gone absolutely white, and his eyes were starting from their sockets. Gibbering insanely, Urtag fled, and the sound of his screams echoed back down the iron stairway as he ran in terror from the ruined tower. Chapter 20. The whispering had begun, almost as soon as Belgarath, Silk, and Geryon reached the coast of Mallorea. It was indistinct at first, little more than a sibilant breath sounding perpetually in Geryon's ears. But in the days that followed, as they moved steadily south, occasional words began to emerge. The words were the sort to be reckoned with: home, mother, love, and death. Words upon which attention immediately fastened. Unlike the land of the Morindum, which they had left behind, northernmost Mallorea was a land of rolling hills covered with a tough-stemmed, dark green grass. Occasional nameless rivers wound among those hills, roiling and turbulent beneath a lead-gray sky. They had not seen the sun for what seemed like weeks. A sort of dry overcast had moved in off of the sea of the east, and a stiff breeze, chill and smelling of the polar ice, pressed continually at their backs as they moved southward. Belgarath now rode with extreme caution. There was no sign of that half-doze that was his custom in more civilized parts of the world, and Geryon could feel the subtle push of the old man's mind as he probed ahead for any hidden dangers. So delicate was the sorcerer's searching that it seemed only a slowly expiring breath, light, tentative, concealed artfully in the sound of the breeze passing through the tall grass. Silk also rode warily, pausing frequently to listen and seeming on occasion to sniff at the air. Often he would even go so far as to dismount and put his ear to the turf, to see if he might pick up the muffled tread of unseen horses approaching. "Nervous work," the little man said as he remounted after one such pause.
"Better to be a little overcautious than to blunder into something," Belgarath replied. "Did you hear anything?"
"I think I heard a worm crawling around down there," Silk answered brightly. "He didn't say anything, though. You know how worms are."
"Do you mind?"
"Well, you did ask, Belgarath."
"Oh, shut up."
"You heard him ask, didn't you, Geryon?"
"That is probably the most offensive habit I've ever encountered in anyone," Belgarath told the little thief.
"I know," Silk answered. "That's why I do it. Infuriating, isn't it? How far do we have to go before we come to woods again?"
"Several more days. We're still a goodly distance north of the tree line. Winter's too long and summer too short for trees to grow up here."
"Boring sort of a place, isn't it?" Silk observed, looking around at the endless grass and the rounded hills that all looked the same.
"Under the circumstances, I can stand a little boredom. The alternatives are not all that pleasant."
"I can accept that." They rode on, their horses wading through the knee-high gray-green grass. The whispering inside Geryon's head began again.
"Hear me, child of light."
That sentence emerged quite clearly from the rest of the unintelligible sibilance. There was a dreadfully compelling quality in that single statement. Geryon concentrated, trying to hear more. "I wouldn't do that," the familiar dry voice told him. "What?" "Don't do what it tells you to do." "Well, who is it?" "Torak, of course." "Who did you think it was?" "He's awake?" "Not yet. Not fully, at any rate. But then he's never been entirely asleep either." "What's he trying to do?" "He's trying to talk you out of killing him." "He's not afraid of me, is he?" "Of course he's afraid. He does not know what's going to happen any more than you do, and he is just as frightened of you as you are of him." That immediately made Geryon feel better. "What should I do about the way he keeps whispering to me?" "Oh, there's not much you can do. Just don't get into the habit of obeying his orders. That's all." They camped that evening, as they usually did, in a well-sheltered hollow between two hills. As usual, they built no fire to give away their location. "I am getting a bit tired of cold suppers," Silk complained, biting down hard on a piece of dried meat. "This beef's like a strip of old leather."
"The exercise is good for your jaws," Belgariad told him.
"You can be a very unpleasant old man when you set your mind to it. Do you know that?" "The nights are getting longer, aren't they?" Geryon said to head off any further wrangling.
Summer's winding down," Belgariad told him. "It will be autumn up here in another few weeks. Winter's going to be right on its heels."
"I wonder where we will be when winter comes," Geryon said rather plaintively. "I wouldn't do that," Silk advised. "Thinking about it isn't going to help, and it's only going to make you nervous." "Nervous, sir," Geryon corrected. "I'm already nervous." "Is there such a word as nervouser?" Silk asked Belgariad curiously.
"There is now," Belgariad replied. "Geryon just invented it."
"I wish I could invent a word," Silk said admiringly to Geryon, his ferret-like little eyes gleaming mischievously. "Please, don't poke fun at me, Silk. I'm having enough trouble as it is."
"Let's get some sleep," Belgariad suggested. "This conversation's not going anywhere, and we have got a long way to ride tomorrow."
That night, the whispering invaded Geryon's sleep, and it seemed to convey its meaning in images rather than words. There was an offer of friendship, of a hand outstretched in love. The loneliness that had haunted his boyhood from the moment he had discovered that he was an orphan seemed to fade, to pass somehow behind him with that offer, and he found himself rather desperately wanting to run toward that hand reaching toward him. Then, very clearly, he saw two figures standing side by side. The figure of the man was very tall and very powerful, and the figure of the woman was so familiar that the very sight of her caught at Geryon's heart. The tall, powerful man seemed to be a stranger, and yet was not. His face went far beyond mere human handsomeness. It was quite the most beautiful face Geryon had ever seen. The woman, of course, was not a stranger. The white lock at the brow and the glorious eyes were the most familiar things in Geryon's life. Side by side, the beautiful stranger and Aunt Paul reached out their arms to him.
"You will be our son," the whispering voice told him. "Our beloved son. I will be your father, and Polgara your mother. This will be no imaginary thing, child of light, for I can make all things happen. Polgara will really be your mother, and all of her love will be yours alone. And I, your father, will love and cherish you both. Will you turn away from us and face again the bitter loneliness of the orphan child? Does that chill emptiness compare with the warmth of loving parents? Come to us, Belgariad. Accept our love."
Geryon jerked himself out of sleep, sitting bolt upright, trembling and sweating. "I need help," he cried out silently, reaching into the vaults of his mind to find that other nameless presence.
"What's your problem now?" the dry voice asked him.
"He's cheating," Geryon declared, outraged.
"Cheating? Did somebody come along and make up a set of rules while I was not watching?"
"You know what I mean. He's offering to make Aunt Paul my mother if I'll do what he says."
"He's lying. He cannot alter the past. Ignore him."
"How can I? He keeps reaching into my mind and putting his hand on the most sensitive spots."
"Think about Tynedra. That will confuse him."
"Tynedra?"
"Every time he tries to tempt you with Polgara, think about your flighty little princess. Remember exactly how she looked when you peeked at her while she was bathing that time back in the Wood of the Dryads."
"I did not peek."
"Really? How is it that you remember every single detail so vividly, then?"
Geryon blushed. He had forgotten that his daydreams were not entirely private.
"Just concentrate on Tynedra.
It will probably irritate Torak almost as much as it does me." The voice paused. "Is that all you can really think about?" it asked then. Geryon did not try to answer that. They pushed on southward under the dirty overcast, and 2 days later they reached the first trees, scattered sparsely at the edge of the grassland where great herds of antlered creatures grazed as placidly and as unafraid as cattle. As the three of them rode south, the scattered clumps of trees became thicker, and soon spread into a forest of dark-boughed evergreens. The whispering blandishments of Torak continued, but Geryon countered them with thoughts of his red-haired little princess. He could sense the irritation of his enemy each time he intruded these daydreams upon the carefully orchestrated images that Torak kept trying to instill in his imagination. Torak wanted him to think of his loneliness and fear, and of the possibility of becoming a part of a loving family. But the intrusion of Tsenedra into the picture confused and baffled the god. Geryon soon perceived that Torak's understanding of men was severely limited. Concerned more with elementals, with those towering compulsions and ambitions which had inflamed him for the endless aeons, Torak could not cope with the scattered complexities and the conflicting desires that motivated most men. Geryon seized on his advantage to thwart the insidious and compelling whispers with which Torak tried to lure him from his purpose. The whole business was somehow peculiarly familiar. This had happened before. Not perhaps in exactly the same way, but very similarly. He sorted through his memories, trying to pin down this strange sense of repetition. It was the sight of a twisted tree stump, lightning-blasted and charred, that suddenly brought it all flooding back in on him. The stump, when seen from a certain angle, bore a vague resemblance to a man on horseback, a dark rider, who seemed to watch them as they rode by. Because the sky was overcast, the stump cast no shadow, and the image clicked into place. Throughout his childhood, hovering always on the edge of his vision, Geryon had seen the strange, menacing shape of a dark-cloaked rider on a black horse, shadowless, even in the brightest sunlight. That had been Asherak the Murgo, of course, the Grolem whom Geryon had destroyed in his first open act as a sorcerer. But had it? There had existed between Geryon and that dark figure which had so haunted his childhood a strange bond. They had been enemies. Geryon had always known that. But in their enmity there had always been a curious closeness, something that seemed to pull them together. Geryon quite deliberately began to examine a startling possibility. Suppose that the Dark Rider had not, in fact, been Asherak. Or, if it had been, suppose that Asherak had somehow been suffused by another more powerful awareness. The more he thought about it, the more convinced Geryon became that he had stumbled inadvertently across the truth of the matter. Torak had demonstrated that even though his body slept, his awareness could still move about the world, twisting events to his own purposes. Asherak had been involved, certainly, but the dominating force had always been the consciousness of Torak. The dark god had stood watch over him since infancy. The fear he had sensed in that dark shape that had hovered always on the edge of his boyhood had not been Asherak's fear, but Torak's. Torak had known who he was from the beginning, had known that one day Geryon would take up the sword of the Raven King and come to the meeting that had been ordained since before the world was made. Acting upon a sudden impulse, Geryon put his left hand inside his tunic and took hold of his amulet. Twisting slightly, he reached up and laid the marked palm of his right hand on the orb, which stood on the pommel of the great sword strapped across his back. "I know you now," he declared silently, hurling the thought at the murky sky. "You might as well give up trying to win me over to your side, because I'm not going to change my mind. Aunt Paul is not your wife, and I am not your son. You had better stop trying to play games with my thoughts and get ready. Because I am coming to kill you." The orb beneath his hand flared with a sudden exultation as Geryon threw his challenge into the dark god's teeth, and the sword at Geryon's back suddenly burst into a blue flame that flickered through the sheath enclosing it. There was a moment of deadly silence, and then what had been a whisper suddenly became a vast roar. "Come, then, Belgariad, child of light," Torak hurled back the challenge. "I await thee in the city of night. Bring all thy will and all thy courage with thee, for I am ready for our meeting." "What in the name of the 7 gods do you think you're doing?" Belgarath almost screamed at Geryon, his face mottled with angry astonishment. "Torak's been whispering at me for almost a week now," Geryon explained calmly, taking his hand from the orb. "He's been offering me all kinds of things if I'd give up this whole idea. I got tired of it, so I told him to stop." Belgarath spluttered indignantly, waving his hands at Geryon. "He knows I'm coming, grandfather," Geryon said, trying to placate the infuriated old man. "He's known who I was since the day I was born. He's been watching me all this time. We're not going to be able to take him by surprise, so why try? I wanted to let him know that I was on to him. Maybe it's time for him to start worrying and being afraid just a little bit too." Silk was staring at Geryon. "He's an Alon, all right," he observed finally. "He's an idiot," Belgarath snapped angrily. He turned back to Geryon. "Did it ever occur to you that there might be something out here to worry about besides Torak?" Geryon blinked. "Tol Mishrak is not unguarded, you young blockhead. You have just succeeded in announcing our presence to every Grolem within 100 leagues." "I didn't think of that," Geryon mumbled. "I didn't think you had thought. Sometimes I don't think you know how to think." Silk looked around apprehensively. "Now, what do we do?" he asked. "We had better get out of here, as fast as our horses can carry us," Belgarath said. He glared at Geryon. "Are you sure you don't have a trumpet somewhere under your clothes?" he asked with heavy sarcasm. "Maybe you'd like to blow a few fanfares as we go along." He shook his head in disgust, then gathered up his reins. "Let's ride," he said. Chapter 21. The aspens were stark white and motionless under the dead sky, and they rose, straight and slender, like the bars of an interminable cage. Belgarath led them at a walk, carefully weaving his way through the endless stretches of this vast, silent forest. "How much farther?" Silk asked the old man tensely. "Not much more than a day now," Belgarath replied. "The clouds ahead are getting thicker." "You say the cloud bank never moves?" "Never. It has been stationary since Torak put it there." "What if a wind comes along? Would that not move it?" Belgarath shook his head. "The normal rules have been suspended in that region. For all I know, the cloud might not actually be a cloud. It might be something else." "Like what?" "An illusion of some kind, perhaps. The gods are very good at illusions." "Are they looking for us? The Grolems, I mean." Belgarath nodded. "Are you taking steps to keep them from finding us?" "Naturally. Why this sudden urge for conversation? You've been talking steadily for the last hour." "I'm a little bit edgy," Sulk admitted. "This is unfamiliar territory, and that always makes me nervous. I am more comfortable when I've got my escape routes worked out in advance." "Are you always ready to run?" "In my profession, you have to be." "What was that?" Geryon heard it too. Faintly, somewhere far off behind them, there was a deep-toned baying. One animal at first, but soon joined by others. "Wolves?" he suggested. Belgarath's face had grown bleak. "No, not wolves." He shook his reins, and his nervous horse began to trot, the sound of its hooves muffled by the rotting loam lying thick beneath the aspens.
"What is it, then, grandfather?"
Geryon asked, also pushing his horse into a trot. "Torak's hounds," Belgarath replied tersely.
"Dogs?"
"Not really. They are grolums, rather specialized ones. When the Engraks built the city, Torak decided that he needed something to guard the surrounding countryside. Certain grolums volunteered to take on non-human shapes. The change was permanent."
"I have dealt with watchdogs before," Silk said confidently.
"Not like these. Let's see if we can outrun them."
Belgarath did not sound very hopeful. They pushed their horses into a gallop, weaving in and out among the tree trunks. The limbs slapped against their faces as they rode, and Geryon raised his arm to ward them off as the three of them plunged on. They crested a low ridge and galloped down the far side. The baying behind them seemed to be closer now. Then Silk's horse stumbled, and the little man was almost thrown from his saddle.
"This isn't working, Belgarath," he said as the old man and Geryon reined in. "This ground's too treacherous for us to keep this pace." Belgarath held up his hand and listened for a moment. The deep-toned baying was definitely closer.
"Oh, they're outrunning us anyway," the old man agreed.
"You had better think of something," Silk said, looking back nervously.
"I am working on it."
Belgarath raised his face to sniff at the air.
"Let's keep going. I just got a whiff of stagnant water. The area's dotted with swampy places. We might be able to hide our scent if we can get into a big enough patch of water."
They moved on down the slope toward the bottom of the valley. The odor of standing water grew steadily stronger as they rode. "Just ahead," Geryon pointed toward a patch of brown water intermittently visible among the white tree trunks. The swamp was quite extensive, a broad patch of reeking, oily water trapped in the bottom of a thickly grown basin. Dead trees thrust up out of the water, their leafless branches seeming almost like clawed hands reaching up in mute supplication to the indifferent sky. Silk wrinkled his nose. "It stinks bad enough to hide our scent from almost anything."
"We will see," Belgarath replied. "This might throw off an ordinary dog. But don't forget that the hounds are really grolums. They have the ability to reason, so they won't be relying on scent alone."
They pushed their reluctant horses into the murky water and began to splash along, changing direction frequently, weaving in and out among the dead tree trunks. Their horses' hooves stirred up rotting vegetation from the bottom, filling the air with an even more powerful stench. The sound of the baying hounds drew closer, filled now with an excitement and a terrible hunger.
"I think they have hit the edge of the swamp," Silk said, cocking his head to listen.
There was a momentary bafflement in the baying behind them.
"Grandfather!"
Geryon cried, reining in sharply. Directly before them, knee-deep in the brown water, stood a slavering black dog shape. It was enormous, fully as large as a horse, and its eyes actually burned with a malevolent green fire. Its front shoulders and chest were massive, and the fangs protruding from its mouth were at least a foot long, curving down cruelly and dripping foam.
"We have you now," it growled,
seeming almost to chew the words as it twisted its muzzle into speech. The voice issuing from its mouth was a rasping, tearing sound. Silk's hand instantly flashed toward one of his hidden daggers.
"Never mind," Belgarath told him. "It's only a projection, a shadow."
"It can do that?" Silk's tone was startled.
"I told you, they're grolums."
"We hunger," the fiery-eyed hound rumbled. "I will return soon with my packmates, and we will feed on man meat."
Then the shape flickered and vanished.
"They know where we are now." Silk's voice was alarmed. "You had better do something, Belgarath. Can't you use sorcery?" "That would just pinpoint our location. There are other things out there as well as the hounds."
"I'd say that we'd have to chance it. Let us worry about one thing at a time. Did you see those teeth?" "They're coming," Geryon said tensely. From far back in the swamp he could clearly hear the sound of splashing. "Do something, Belgarath!" The sky overhead had grown darker, and the air seemed suddenly oppressively heavy. From far off there was an angry mutter of thunder. A vast sigh seemed to pass through the forest.
"Keep going,"
Belgarath said, and they splashed off through the slimy brown water toward the far side of the swamp. The aspen trees on the solid ground ahead of them quite suddenly turned the silvery undersides of their leaves upward, and it was almost as if a great pale wave had shuddered through the forest. The hounds were very close now, and their braying was triumphant as they plunged through the oily, reeking swamp. Then there was a brilliant blue-white flash and a shattering clap of thunder. The sky ripped open above them. With a sound nearly as loud as the thunder, they were engulfed in a sudden deluge. The wind howled, ripping away the aspen leaves in great sheets and whirling them through the air. The rain drove horizontally before the sudden gale, churning the swamp to froth and obliterating everything more than a few feet away. "Did you do this?" Silk shouted at Belgarath. But Belgarath's stunned face clearly said that the storm was as much a surprise to him as it was to Silk. They both turned to look at Geryon.
"Did you do it?"
Belgarath demanded. "He didn't. I did." The voice which came from Geryon's mouth was not his. "I've labored too long at this to be thwarted by a pack of dogs."
"I didn't hear a thing,"
Belgarath marveled, wiping at his steaming face.
"Not even a whisper."
"You were listening at the wrong time," the voice of Geryon's inner companion replied. "I set it in motion early last spring. It's just now getting here."
"You knew that we would need it?"
"Obviously. Turn east. The hounds won't be able to track you in all of this. Swing around and come at the city from the east side. There are fewer watchers on that flank." The downpour continued, punctuated by ripping claps of thunder and flashes of lightning.
"How long will the rain last?"
Belgarath shouted over the noise. "Long enough. It's been building in the Sea of the East for a week. It hit the coast this morning. Turn east."
"Can we talk as we ride?" Belgarath asked. "I have a great many questions."
"This is hardly the time for discussion, Belgarath. You have to hurry. The others arrived at Khol Mishrak this morning just ahead of the storm. Everything's ready there, so move."
"It's going to be tonight."
"Yes, if you get there in time. Torak's almost awake now. I think you had better be there when he opens his eyes." Belgarath wiped his streaming face again, and his eyes had a worried look.
"Let's go,"
he said sharply, and he led them splashing off through the driving rain to solid ground. The rain continued for several hours, driven before a screaming wind. Sodden, miserable, and half-blinded by flying leaves and twigs, the three of them cantered toward the east. The baying of the hounds, trapped in the swamp, faded behind them, taking on a baffled, frustrated note as the thunderous deluge obliterated all scent from the swamp and the forest. When night fell, they had reached a low range of hills far to the east, and the rain had subsided into a steady, unpleasant drizzle, punctuated by periodic squalls of chilly, gusting wind and erratic downpours that swept in randomly off of the Sea of the East. "Are you sure you know the way?" Silk asked Belgarath.
"I can find it,"
Belgarath said grimly.
"Khol Mishrak's got a peculiar smell to it."
The rain slackened into a few scattered droplets, pattering on the leaves overhead, and died out entirely by the time they had reached the edge of the wood. The smell of which Belgarath had spoken was not a sharp reek, but rather was a muted, dank compound of odors. Damp rust seemed to be a major part of it, although the reek of stagnant water was also present, and the musty scent of fungus. The overall effect was one of decay. When they reached the last of the trees, Belgarath reined in.
"Well, there it is,"
he said in a quiet voice. The basin before them was faintly illuminated by a kind of pale, sickly radiance that seemed to emanate from the ground itself. And in the center of that large depression reared the jagged, broken remains of the city.
"What's that strange light?"
Geryon whispered tensely. Belgarath grunted. "Phosphorescence. It comes from the fungus that grows everywhere out there. The sun never shines on Thal Mishrek, so it's a natural breeding ground for unwholesome things that grow in the dark. We will leave the horses here."
He dismounted.
"Is that a very good idea?" Silk asked him, as he too swung down from his saddle. "We might want to leave in a hurry." The little man was still wet and shivering. "No," Belgarath said calmly. "If things go well, nothing in the city's going to be interested in giving us any trouble. If things don't go well, it's not going to matter anyway."
"I don't like unalterable commitments," Silk muttered sourly.
"You picked the wrong journey, then," Belgarath replied. "What we are about to do is just about as unalterable as things ever get. Once we start, there won't be any possible way to turn back."
"I still don't have to like it, do I? What now?"
"Geryon and I are going to change into something a bit less conspicuous. You are an expert at moving about in the dark without being seen or heard, but we are not that skilled at it."
"You're going to use sorcery? This close to Torak?"
Silk asked him incredulously. "We're going to be very quiet about it," Belgarath assured him. "The shape change is directed almost entirely inward, so there isn't much noise involved anywhere." He turned to Geryon. "We're going to do it slowly. That spreads out what little sound there is and makes it even fainter. Do you understand?"
"I think so, grandfather."
"I'll go first. Watch me."
The old man glanced at their horses.
"Let's move away a bit. Horses are afraid of wolves. We don't want them to get hysterical and start crashing around."
They crept along the edge of the trees until they were some distance from the horses.
"This ought to be far enough. Now, watch."
He concentrated for a moment, and then his form began to shimmer and blur. The changeover was very gradual, and for several moments his face, the wolf's face, seemed to coexist together in the same place. The sound it made was the only faintest of whispers. Then it was done, and the great silver wolf sat on his haunches.
"Now, you do it," he told Geryon, with that slight change of expression that is so much a part of the speech of wolves. Geryon concentrated very hard, holding the shape firmly in his mind. He did it so slowly that it seemed that he could actually feel the fur growing on his body. Silk had been rubbing dirt on his face and hands to reduce the visibility of his skin. He looked at the two wolves, his eyes questioning. Belgarath nodded once and led the way out onto the bare earth of the basin that sloped down toward the rotting ruins of Thal Mishrek. There were other shapes moving in the faint light, prowling, snuffling. Some of the shapes had a dog smell to them. Others smelled faintly reptilian. Grolems, robed and cowled, stood watch on various hummocks and rocks, searching the darkness with their eyes and their minds for intruders. The earth beneath Geryon's paws felt dead. There was no growth, no life on this wasted heath. With Silk crouched low between them, the two wolves crept belly-low toward the ruin, taking full advantage of rocky outcrops and eroded gullies. Their pace seemed excruciatingly slow to Geryon, but Belgarath paid little attention to the passage of time. Occasionally, when they passed near one of the watching Grolems, they moved but one paw at a time. The minutes dragged by as they crept closer and closer to the broken city of night. Near the shattered wall, two of the hooded priests of Torak stood in quiet conversation. Their muted voices fell clearly upon Geryon's intensely sharpened ears.
"The hounds seem nervous tonight," one of them said.
"The storm," the other replied.
Bad weather always makes them edgy. I wonder what it's like to be a hound, the first Grolem mused. If you like, perhaps they will let you join them. I don't think that I am that curious.
Silk and the two wolves, moving as silently as smoke, passed no more than 10 yards from the two idly chatting guards, and crept over the fallen stones into the dead city of night. Once among the ruins, they were able to move faster. The shadows concealed their movements, and they flitted among the blasted stones in Belgarath's wake, moving steadily toward the center of the city where the stump of the iron tower now reared, stark and black, toward the murky sky. The reek of rust, stagnation, and decay was much stronger, coming to Gerion's wolf-sharp nose in an almost overpowering wave. It was a gagging smell, and he clamped his muzzle shut and tried not to think about it.
"Who's there?"
A voice came sharply from just ahead of them. A Grolem with a drawn sword stepped out into the rubble-strewn street, peering intently into the deep shadows where the three crouched, frozen into immobility. Gerion sensed rather than heard or saw Silk's slow, deliberate reach toward the dagger sheathed at the back of his neck. Then the little man's arm swung sharply down, and his knife made a fluttering whistle as it sped with deadly accuracy, turning end for end as it flew. The Grolem grunted, doubling over sharply, and then he sighed and toppled forward, his sword clanging as it fell. "Let's move." Silk ran past the huddled form of the dead Grolem sprawled on the stones. Gerion smelled fresh blood as he loped past, and the smell brought a sudden hot taste to his mouth. They reached the massive tangle of twisted girders and crumpled plates that had been the iron tower, and crept silently through the open doorway into the total darkness of the chamber within. The smell of rust was everywhere now. Coupled with it was a smell of ancient, brooding evil. Gerion stopped, sniffing nervously at the tainted air, feeling his hackles rising on his ruffed neck. With an effort he suppressed the low growl that rose involuntarily in his throat. He felt Belgarath's shoulder brush him, and he followed the old wolf, guided now by scent alone in the utter blackness. At the far end of the huge, empty iron room there was another doorway. Belgarath stopped, and Gerion felt again that faint brushing whisper as the old man slowly shifted back into the shape of a man. Gerion clenched in his own will and let himself gradually flow back into his own form. Silk was breathing a string of colorful curses, fervent but almost inaudible.
"What's the matter?" Belgarath whispered.
"I forgot to stop for my knife," Silk replied, grating his teeth together. "It is one of my favorites."
"What now, grandfather?"
Gerion asked, his whisper hoarse.
"Just beyond this door. There is a flight of stairs leading down."
"What's at the bottom?"
"A cellar. It is a sort of tomb, where Zadar's got Torak's body. Shall we go down?"
Gerion sighed, then squared his shoulders.
"I guess that's what we came for,"
he replied. Chapter 22. "You don't actually believe I'll accept that, do you, Zadar?" Gerion froze in the act of putting his hand on the iron door at the foot of the stairs. "You can't evade your responsibility with the pretense of necessity," the voice beyond the door continued.
"Aren't we all driven by necessity, Belgara?"
a stranger's voice replied, with a kind of weary sadness.
"I won't say that I was blameless, but wasn't my apostasy predestined? The universe has been divided against itself since the beginning of time, and now the two prophecies rush toward each other for their final meeting, when all will be resolved. Who can say that what I have done was not essential to that meeting?"
"That is an evasion, Zadar."
"What's she doing here?"
Gerion whispered to Belgarath.
"She's supposed to be here,"
Belgarath whispered back, with an odd note of satisfaction.
Listen. I don't think we'll gain anything by wrangling with each other, Polgara,
Zadar the Apostate was saying.
We each believe that what we did was right. Neither of us could ever persuade the other to change sides at this point. Why don't we just let it go at that?
Very well, Zadar, Aunt Paul replied coolly. What now? Silk breathed.
There should be others in there too,
Belgarath answered softly.
Let's make sure before we go bursting in.
The iron door in front of them did not fit tightly, and faint light seeped through the cracks around the frame. Garion could make out Belgarath's intent face in that dim light.
How's your father?
Zadar asked in a neutral tone. About the same as always. He is very angry with you, you know.
That was to be expected, I suppose.
He has finished eating, Lady Polgara,
Garion heard Zenedra saying. He looked sharply at Belgarath, but the old man put one finger to his lips. Spread one of those pallets out for him, dear, Aunt Paul instructed, and cover him with some blankets. It is very late, and he's sleepy.
I'll do that,
Dernick offered.
Good,
Belgarath breathed.
They are all here.
How did they get here? Silk whispered.
I haven't the faintest idea, and I'm not going to worry about it. The important thing is that they are here. I'm glad you were able to rescue him from Tuchik,
Zadar said.
I grew rather fond of him during the years we spent together.
Where did you find him? Aunt Paul asked. We have never been able to pin down what country he is from.
I forgot precisely,
Zadar answered, and his voice was faintly troubled.
Perhaps it was Kamar, or Tolhanath, or maybe some city on the other side of Mallorea. The details keep slipping away from me, almost as if I weren't supposed to examine them too closely.
Try to remember. It might be important.
Zadar sighed. If it amuses you,
he said. He paused as if thinking.
I had grown restless for some reason. It was, 50 or 60 years ago. My studies no longer interested me, and the bickering of the various Grodum factions began to irritate me. I took to wandering about, not really paying much attention to where I was. I must have crossed and crisscrossed the kingdoms of the West and the Engrak kingdoms a half-dozen times in those years. Anyway, I was passing through some city somewhere when the idea struck me all at once. We all know that the orb will destroy anyone who touches it with the slightest trace of evil in his heart. But what would it do to someone who touched it in total innocence? I was stunned by the simplicity of the idea. The street I was on was full of people, and I needed quiet to consider this remarkable idea. So I turned a corner into some forgotten alley, and there the child was, almost as if he had been waiting for me. He seemed to be about 2 years old at the time, old enough to walk, not much more. I held out my hand to him and said, I have a little errand for you, my boy. He came to me and repeated the word, errand. It is the only word I've ever heard him say.
What did the orb do when he first touched it? Aunt Paul asked.
It flickered. In some peculiar way it seemed to recognize him. Something seemed to pass between them when he laid his hand upon it.
He sighed then.
No, Polgara. I do not know who the child is, or even what he is. For all I know, he may even be an illusion. The idea to use him in the first place came to me so suddenly that I sometimes wonder if perhaps it was placed in my mind. It is entirely possible, I suppose, that I didn't find him, but that he found me.
He fell silent again. There was a long pause on the other side of the iron door. Why, Zadar? Aunt Paul asked him very quietly. Why did you betray our master? Her voice was strangely compassionate.
To save the orb,
he replied sadly.
What was the idea at first, at least? From the moment I first saw it, it owned me. After Torak took it from our master, Belgarath and the others began making their plans to regain it by force. But I knew that if Aldur himself did not join his hand with theirs to strike directly at Torak, they would fail, and Aldur would not do that. I reasoned that if force must fail, then guile might succeed. I thought that by pretending allegiance to Torak, I might gain his confidence and steal it back from him.
What happened, Zadar? Her question was very direct. There was another long, painful pause.
Oh, Belgarath,
Zadar's voice came in a strangled sob.
You cannot know. I was so sure of myself, so certain that I could keep a part of my mind free from Torak's domination. But I was wrong. His mind and will overwhelmed me. He took me in his hand and he crushed out all of my resistance. Oh, the touch of his hand, Belgarath.
There was horror in Zadar's voice.
It reaches down into the very depths of your soul. I know Torak for what he is. Loathsome, twisted, evil beyond our understanding of the word. But when he calls me, I must go, and what he bids me I must do, even though my soul shrieks within me against it. Even now, as he sleeps, his fist is around my heart.
There was another hoarse sob. Didn't you know that it is impossible to resist a god? Aunt Paul asked in that same voice. Was it pride, Zadar? Were you so sure of your power that you thought you could trick him? That you could conceal your intentions from him? Zadar sighed.
Perhaps. Aldur was a gentle master. He never brought his mind down on me, so I was not prepared for what Torak did to me. Torak is not gentle. What he wants, he takes, and if he must rip out your soul in the taking, it doesn't matter to him in the slightest. You will discover his power, Belgarath. Soon he will awaken and he will destroy Belgariad. Not even the Raven King is a match for that awful mind. And then Torak will take you as his bride, as he has always said that he would. Do not resist him, Belgarath. Save yourself that agony. In the end, you will go to him anyway. You will go willingly, even eagerly.
There was a sudden scraping sound in the room beyond the iron door and a quick rush of feet. "Jarnik!" Aunt Paul cried sharply. "No!" "What's happening?" Gerion demanded of Belgarath.
"That's what it means," Belgarath gasped. "Get that door open. Get back, you fool!"
Zadar was shouting. There was a sudden crash, the sound of bodies locked in struggle, smashing into furniture.
"I warn you," Zadar cried again. "Get back!"
There was the sharp sound of a blow, of a fist striking solid bone.
"Zadar!"
Belgarath roared, yanking at the iron door. Then, within the room, there was a thunderous detonation. "Jarnik!" Aunt Paul shrieked. In a sudden burst of fury, Belgarath raised his clenched hand, joined his flaming will with his arm, and drove his fist at the iron door. The massive force of his blow ripped the locked iron door from its hinges, as if it had been no more than paper. The room beyond had a vaulted, curved ceiling supported by great iron girders, black with age. Gerion seemed to see everything in the room at once, with a curious kind of detachment, as if all emotion had been drained from him. He saw Tzinedra and Erend clinging to each other in fright beside one wall. Aunt Paul was standing as if locked in place, her eyes wide as she stared in stunned disbelief at the still form of Durnik the smith, who lay crumpled on the floor, and whose face had that deadly pale cast to it that could only mean one thing. A terrible flood of realization suddenly swept her face, a realization of an irrevocable loss.
"No!"
she cried out.
"My Darnick, no!"
She rushed to the fallen man, fell on her knees beside him, and gathered his still form into her arms with a heart-broken wail of grief and despair. And then Geryon saw Zadar, the apostate, for the first time. The sorcerer was also staring at Dernick's body. There was a desperate regret on his face, a knowledge that he had finally committed the one act that forever put him past all hope of redemption.
"You fool," he muttered. Why did you make me kill you? That's the one thing above all others that I did not want to do."
Then Belgarath, as inexorable as death itself, lunged into the room through the shattered remnants of the door, and rushed upon the man he had once called brother. Zadar flinched back from the old sorcerer's awful rage.
"I didn't mean to do it, Belgarath,"
he quavered, his hands raised to ward off Belgarath's rush.
"The fool tried to attack me. He was—"
"You," Belgarath grated at him from between teeth clenched with hate.
You...
But he was past speech. No word could contain his rage. He raised both arms and struck at Zadar's face with his fists. Zadar reeled back, but Belgarath was upon him, grappling, pounding at him with his hands. Geryon could feel flickers of will from one or the other of them, but caught up in emotions so powerful that they erased thought. Neither was coherent enough to focus the force within him. And so, like two tavern brawlers, they rolled on the floor, kicking, gouging, pounding at each other, Belgarath consumed with fury, and Zadar with fear and chagrin. Desperately, the apostate jerked a dagger from the sheath at his waist, and Belgarath seized his wrist in both hands and pounded it on the floor until the knife went skittering away. Then each struggled to reach the dagger, clawing and jerking at each other, their faces frozen into intense grimaces as each strove to reach the dagger first. At some point during the frenzied seconds when they had burst into the room, Geryon had, unthinking, drawn the great sword from its sheath across his back, but the orb and the blade were cold and unresponsive in his hand as he stood watching the deadly struggle between the two sorcerers. Belgarath's hands were locked about Zadar's throat, and Zadar, strangling, clawed desperately at the old man's arms. Belgarath's face was contorted into an animal snarl, his lips drawn back from clenched teeth as he throttled his ancient enemy. As if finally driven past all hope of sanity, he struggled to his feet, dragging Zadar up with him. Holding the apostate by the throat with one hand, he began to rain blows on him with the other. Then, between one blow and the next, he swung his arm down and pointed at the stones beneath their feet. With a dreadful grinding, a great crack appeared, zigzagging across the floor. The rocks shrieked in protest as the crack widened. Still struggling, the two men toppled and fell into the yawning fissure. The earth seemed to shudder. With a terrible sound, the crack ground shut. Incredulously, his mouth suddenly agape, Geryon stared in stunned disbelief at the scarcely discernible crack through which the two men had fallen. Tinedra screamed, her hands going to her face in horror. "Do something!" Silk shouted at Geryon, but Geryon could only stare at him in blank incomprehension. "Bolgara!" Silk said desperately, turning to Aunt Paul. Still incapacitated by her sudden, overwhelming grief, she could not respond, but knelt with Dernick's lifeless body in her arms, weeping uncontrollably as she rocked back and forth, holding him tightly against her. From infinitely far beneath, there was a sullen detonation and then another. Even in the bowels of the earth, the deadly struggle continued. As if compelled, Geryon's eyes sought out the embrasure in the far wall. There, in the dim light, he could make out the recumbent form of Kal Torak. Strangely emotionless, Geryon stared at the form of his enemy, meticulously noting every detail. He saw the black robe, the polished mask. He saw Trechgoru, Torak's great black sword. Although he did not, could not, move or even feel, a struggle nonetheless raged inside him, a struggle perhaps even more dreadful than that which had just plunged Belgarath and Zadar into the depths of the earth. The two forces which had first diverged and then turned and rushed at each other down the endless corridors of time had finally met within him. The event, which was the ultimate conclusion of the two prophecies, had begun, and its first skirmishes were taking place within Gerion's mind. Minute and very subtle adjustments were shifting some of his most deeply ingrained attitudes and perceptions. Torak moved, stirring restlessly, as those same two forces met within him. Dreadful flashes of the sleeping god's mind assailed Gerion, and he saw clearly the terrible subterfuge that lay behind Torak's offer of friendship and love. Had his fear of their duel drawn him into yielding, fully half of creation would have shimmered and vanished. More than that, what Torak had offered was not love, but an enslavement so vile that it was beyond imagining. But he had not yielded. He had somehow evaded the overwhelming force of Torak's mind, and had placed himself utterly in the hands of the prophecy that had drawn him here. With an absolute denial of self, he had become the instrument of the prophecy. He was no longer afraid. Sword in hand, the child of light awaited the moment when the prophecy would release him to join in deadly struggle with the dark god. Then, even as Silk desperately tried to arouse either Gerion or Polgara to action, the stones of the floor buckled upward, and Belgarath rose from the earth. Gerion, still abstracted and bemused, saw that all traces of the sometimes foolish old man he had known before were gone. The thieving old storyteller had vanished. Even the irritable old man who had led the quest for the orb no longer existed. In their place stood the form of Belgarath the sorcerer, the eternal man, shimmering in the aura of his full power. Chapter 23.
"Where is Zadar?"
Aunt Paul asked, raising her tear-streaked face from Dernick's lifeless body to stare with a dreadful intensity at her father.
"I left him down there,"
Belgarath replied bleakly.
"Dead?"
"No."
"Bring him back."
"Why?"
"To face me."
Her eyes burned. The old man shook his head.
"No, Paul,"
he said to her.
"You have never killed anyone. Let's leave it that way."
She gently lowered Dernick's body to the floor and rose to her feet, her pale face twisted with grief and an awful need.
"Then I will go to him," she declared,
raising both arms as if to strike at the earth beneath her feet.
"No,"
Belgarath told her, extending his own hand.
"You will not."
They stood facing each other, locked in a dreadful silent struggle. Aunt Paul's look at first was one of annoyance at her father's interference. She raised one arm again to bring the force of her will crashing down at the earth, but once again Belgarath put forth his hand.
"Let me go, father."
"No."
She redoubled her efforts, twisting as if trying to free herself from his unseen restraint.
"Let me go, old man," she cried.
"No. Don't do this, Paul. I don't want to hurt you."
She tried again, more desperately this time, but once again Belgarath smothered her will with his. His face hardened, and he set his jaw. In a last effort she flung the whole force of her mind against the barrier that he had erected. Like some great rock, however, the old man remained firm. Finally, her shoulders slumped, and she turned, knelt beside Dernick's body, and began to weep again.
"I am sorry, Paul,"
he said gently.
I never wanted to have to do that. Are you all right?"
"How can you ask that?" she demanded brokenly, wringing her hands over Dernick's silent body.
"That's not what I meant."
She turned her back on him and buried her face in her hands.
"I don't think you could have reached him anyway, Paul," the old man told her. "You know as well as I that what one of us does, another cannot undo."
Silk, his ferret-like face shocked, spoke in a hushed voice.
"What did you do to him?"
"I took him down until we came to solid rock, and then I sealed him up in it."
"Can't he just come up out of the earth the way you did?"
"No. That's impossible for him now. Sorcery is a thought, and no man can exactly duplicate the thought of another. Zadar is imprisoned inside the rock forever, or until I choose to free him."
The old man looked mournfully at Dernick's body.
"And I don't think I'll choose to do that."
"He'll die, won't he?"
Belgariad shook his head.
"No. That was part of what I did to him. He will lie inside the rock until the end of days."
"That is monstrous, Belgariad,"
Silk said in a sick voice.
"So was that,"
Belgariad replied grimly, pointing to Dernick. Geryon could hear what they were saying, and could see them all quite clearly. But it seemed somehow that they were actually someplace else. The others in the underground crypt seemed to be on the periphery of his attention. For him there was only one other in the vaulted chamber, and that other was Kal Torak, his enemy. The restless stirring of the drowsing god became more evident. Geryon's peculiarly multiple awareness, in part his own, in part derived from the orb, and as ever overlaid by the consciousness which he had always called the dry voice in his mind, perceived in that stirring the pain that lay beneath the maimed god's movements. Torak was actually writhing as he half slept. An injured man would heal in time, and his pain would gradually diminish and ultimately disappear, because injury was a part of the human condition. A man was born to be hurt from time to time, and the mechanism for recovery was born within him. A god, on the other hand, was invulnerable, and he had no need for the ability to heal. Thus it was with Torak. The fire, which the orb had loosed upon him when he had used it to crack the world, still seared his flesh, and his pain had not diminished in the slightest down through all of the endless centuries since his maiming. Behind that steel mask, the flesh of the dragon god's face still smoked, and his burned eye still boiled endlessly in the socket. Geryon shuddered, almost pitying that perpetual agony. The child errand pulled himself free from Zenedra's trembling arms and crossed the flagstone floor of the tomb, his small face intent. He stopped, bent and put his hand on Dernick's shoulder. Gently, he shook the dead man, as if trying to wake him. His little face became puzzled when the smith did not respond. He shook again, a bit harder, his eyes uncomprehending.
"Erend,"
Zenedra called to him, her voice breaking.
"Come back. There is nothing we can do."
Erend looked at her, then back to Dernick. Then he gently patted the smith's shoulder with a peculiar little gesture, sighed, and went back to the princess. She caught him suddenly in her arms and began to weep, burying her face against his body. Once again, with that same curious little gesture, he patted her flaming hair. Then from the alcove in the far wall there came a long, rasping sigh, a shuddering expiration of breath. Geryon looked sharply toward the alcove, his hand tightening on the hilt of his cold sword. Torak had turned his head, and his eyes were open. The hideous fire burned in the eye that was not as the god came awake. Belgarath drew in his breath in a sharp hiss as Torak raised the charred stump of his left hand, as if to brush away the last of his sleep, even as his right hand groped for the massive hilt of Crech-Goru, his black sword.
"Geryon,"
Belgarath said sharply. But Geryon, still locked in stasis by the forces focusing upon him, could only stare at the awakening god, a part of him struggling to shake free, and his hand trembling as he fought to lift his sword. "Not yet," the voice whispered.
"Geryon!"
Belgarath actually shouted this time. Then, in a move seemingly born of desperation, the old sorcerer lunged past the bemused young man to fling himself upon the still recumbent form of the dark god. Torak's hand released the hilt of his sword, and almost contemptuously grasped the front of Belgarath's tunic. Lifting the struggling old man from him as one might lift a child, the steel mask twisted into an ugly sneer as the god held the helpless sorcerer out from him. Then, like a great wind, the force of Torak's mind struck, hurling Belgarath across the room, ripping away the front of his tunic. Something glittered across Torak's knuckles, and Geryon realized that it was the silver chain of Belgarath's amulet, the polished medallion of the Standing Wolf. In a very peculiar way, the medallion had always been the center of Belgarath's power, and now it lay in the grip of his ancient enemy. With a dreadfully slow deliberation, the dark god rose, towering over them all, Crech-Goru in his hand.
"Geryon, do something!"
Tynedra screamed. With deadly pace, Torak strode toward the dazed Belgarath, raising his sword, but Aunt Paul sprang to her feet and threw herself between them. Slowly, Torak lowered his sword, and then he smiled a loathsome smile.
"My bride,"
he rasped in a horrid voice.
"Never, Torak."
He ignored her defiance.
"Thou hast come to me at last, Belgara,"
he gloated. "I have come to watch you die."
"Die, Belgara? Me? No, my bride. That is not why thou hast come. My will hast drawn thee to me as was foretold, and now thou art mine. Come to me, my beloved."
"Never."
"Never, Belgara?"
There was a dreadful insinuation in the god's rasping voice.
"Thou wilt submit to me, my bride. I will bend thee to my will. Thy struggle shall but make my victory over thee the sweeter. In the end, I will have thee. Come here."
So overwhelming was the force of his mind that she swayed almost as a tree sways in the grip of a great wind.
"No,"
she gasped, closing her eyes and turning her face away sharply.
"Look at me, Belgara,"
he commanded, his voice now almost purring.
"I am thy fate. All that thou didst think to love before me shall fall away, and thou shalt love only me. Look at me."
Helplessly she turned her head and opened her eyes to stare at him. The hatred and defiance seemed to melt out of her, and a terrible fear came into her face.
"Thy will crumbles, my beloved. Now, come to me."
She must resist. All the confusion was gone now, and Geryon understood at last. This was the real battle. If Aunt Paul succumbed, They were all lost. It had all been for this.
"Help her," the voice within him said.
"Aunt Paul?" Geryon threw the thought at her.
"Remember Dernick."
He knew, without knowing how he knew, that this was the one thing that could sustain her in her deadly struggle. He ranged through his memory now, throwing images of Dernick at her, of the smith's strong hands at work at his forge, of his serious eyes, of the quiet sound of his voice, and most of all, of the good man's unspoken love for her, the love that had been the center of Dernick's entire life. She had begun involuntarily to move, no more than a slight shifting of her weight in preparation for that first fatal step in response to Torak's overpowering command. Once she had made that step, she would be lost. But Geryon's memories of Dernick struck her like a blow. Her shoulders, which had already begun to droop in defeat, suddenly straightened, and her eyes flashed with renewed defiance. "Never," she told the expectantly waiting god. "I will not." Torak's face slowly stiffened. His eyes blazed as he brought the full crushing force of his will to bear upon her, but she stood firmly against all that he could do, clinging to the memory of Dernick, as if to something so solid that not even the will of the dark god could tear it from her. A look of baffled frustration contorted Torak's face as he perceived that she would never yield, that her love would be forever denied to him. She had won, and her victory was like a knife twisting slowly inside him. Thwarted, enraged, maddened by her now unalterable will to resist, Torak raised his face and suddenly howled, a shocking, animal-like sound of overwhelming frustration.
"Then perish both," he raged. "Die with thy father."
And with that, he once more raised his deadly sword. Unflinching, Aunt Paul faced the raging god. "Now, Belgariad," the voice cracked in Geryon's mind. The orb, which had remained cold and dead throughout all the dreadful confrontation between Aunt Paul and the maimed god, suddenly flared into life, and the sword of the Raven King exploded into fire, filling the crypt with an intense blue light. Geryon leaped forward, extending his sword to catch the deadly blow which was already descending upon Aunt Paul's unprotected face. The steel sound of blade against blade was like the striking of a great bell, and it rang within the crypt, shimmering and echoing from the walls. Torak's sword, deflected by the flaming blade, plowed a shower of sparks from the flagstone floor. The god's single eye widened as he recognized all in one glance the Raven King, the flaming sword, and the blazing orb of Aldur. Geryon saw in the look that Torak had already forgotten Aunt Paul, and that now the maimed god's full attention was focused on him.
"And so, thou hast come at last, Belgariad,"
the god greeted him gravely.
"I have awaited thy coming since the beginning of days. Thy fate awaits thee here. Hail, Belgariad, and farewell."
His arm lashed back, and he swung a vast blow, but Geryon, without even thinking, raised his own sword, and once again the crypt rang with the bell note of blade against blade.
"Thou art but a boy, Belgariad. Wilt thou pit thyself against the might and invincible will of a god? Submit to me, and I will spare thy life."
The will of the god of Engerak was now directed at him, and in that instant Geryon fully understood how hard Aunt Paul's struggle had been. He felt the terrible compulsion to obey, draining the strength from him. But suddenly, a vast chorus of voices rang down through all of the centuries to him, crying out the single word, "No!" All the lives of all who preceded him had been directed at this one moment, and those lives infused him now. Though he alone held Iron Grip's sword, Belgariad of Riva was not alone, and Torak's will could not sway him. In a move of absolute defiance, Garion again raised his flaming sword.
"So be it, then,"
Torak roared at him.
"To the death, Belgariad!"
At first it seemed but some trick of the flickering light that filled the tomb, but almost as soon as that thought occurred, Garion saw that Torak was growing larger, swelling upward, towering, expanding. With an awful wrenching sound, he shouldered aside the rusted iron roof of the tomb, bursting upward. Once again, without thinking, without even stopping to consider how to do it, Garion also began to expand, and he, too, exploded through the confining ceiling, shuddering away the rusty debris as he rose. In open air, among the decaying ruins of the City of Night, the two titanic adversaries faced each other beneath the perpetual cloud that blotted out the sky. "The conditions are met," the dry voice spoke through Garion's lips.
"So it would seem."
Another equally unemotional voice came from Torak's steel-encased mouth.
"Do you wish to involve the others?"
Garion's voice asked.
"It hardly seems necessary. These two have sufficient capacity for what must be brought to bear upon them."
"Then let it be decided here."
"Agreed."
And with that, Garion felt a sudden release as all constraint was removed from him. Torak, also released, raised Krechgoru, his lips drawn back in a snarl of hate. Their struggle was immense. Rocks shattered beneath the colossal force of deflected blows. The sword of the Raven King danced in blue flames, and Krechgoru, Torak's blade of shadows, swept a visible darkness with it at every blow. Beyond thought, beyond any emotion but blind hatred, the two swung and parried and lurched through the broken ruins, crushing all beneath them. The elements themselves erupted as the fight continued. The wind shrieked through the rotting city, tearing at the trembling stones. Lightning seethed about them, glaring and flickering. The earth rumbled and shook beneath their massive feet. The featureless cloud that had concealed the City of Night beneath its dark mantle for 5 millennia began to boil and race above them. Great patches of stars appeared and disappeared in the roiling middle of the surging cloud. The Grolums, both human and non-human, aghast at the towering struggle that had suddenly erupted in their very midst, fled, shrieking in terror. Garion's blows were directed at Torak's blind side, and the dark god flinched from the fire of the orb each time the flaming sword struck. But the shadow of Krechgoru put a deathly chill into Garion's blood each time it passed over him. They were more evenly matched than Garion had imagined possible. Torak's advantage of size had been erased when they had both swelled into immensity, and Garion's inexperience was offset by Torak's maiming. It was the uneven ground that betrayed Garion. Retreating before a sudden flurry of massive blows, he felt one heel catch on a heap of tumbled rock, and the rotten stones crumbled and rolled beneath his feet. Despite his scrambling attempt to keep his balance, he fell. Torak's single eye blazed in triumph as he raised the dark sword. But, seizing his sword hilt in both hands, Garion raised his burning blade to meet that vast blow. When the swords struck edge to edge, a huge shower of sparks cascaded down over Garion. Again Torak raised Krechgoru, but a strange hunger flickered across his steel-encased face.
"Yield!"
he roared. Garion stared up at the huge form towering over him, his mind racing.
"I have no wish to kill thee, boy,"
Torak said.
"Yield, and I will spare thy life," he said it almost pleading.
And then Garion understood. His enemy was not trying to kill him, but was striving instead to force him to submit. Torak's driving need was for domination. This was where the real struggle between them lay.
"Throw down thy sword, child of light. Bow before me,"
the god commanded, and the force of his mind was like a crushing weight. "I will not," Geryon gasped, wrenching away from that awful compulsion. "You may kill me, but I will not yield." Torak's face twisted, as if his perpetual agony had been doubled by Geryon's refusal.
"Thou must,"
he almost sobbed.
"Thou art helpless before me. Submit to me."
"No!" Geryon shouted, and taking advantage of Torak's chagrin at that violent rejection, he rolled out from under the shadow of Trachgoru and sprang again to his feet. Everything was clear now, and he knew at last how he could win. "Hear me, maimed and despised god," he grated from between clenched teeth. "You are nothing. Your people fear you, but they do not love you. You tried to deceive me into loving you. You tried to force Aunt Paul to love you. But I refuse you, even as she did. You are a god, but you're nothing. In all the universe, there's not one person, not one thing that loves you. You are alone and empty, and even if you kill me, I will still win. Unloved and despised, you will howl out your miserable life to the end of days." Geryon's words struck the maimed god like blows, and the orb, as if echoing those words, blazed anew, lashing at the dragon god with its consuming hatred. This was the event for which the universe had waited since the beginning of time. This was why Geryon had come to this decaying ruin, not to fight Torak, but to reject him. With an animal howl of anguish and rage, the Child of Dark raised Trachgoru above his head and ran at the Raven King. Geryon made no attempt to ward off the blow, but gripped the hilt of his flaming sword in both hands, and, extending his blade before him, he lunged at his charging enemy. It was so easy. The sword of the Raven King slid into Torak's chest like a stick into water, and as it ran into the god's suddenly stiffening body, the power of the orb surged up the flaring blade. Torak's vast hand opened convulsively, and Trachgoru tumbled harmlessly from his grip. He opened his mouth to cry out, and blue flame gushed like blood from his mouth. He clawed at his face, ripping away the polished steel mask to reveal the hideously maimed features that had lain beneath. Tears started from his eyes, both the eye that was and the eye that was not. But the tears were also fire, for the sword of the Raven King buried in his chest filled him with its flame. He lurched backward. With a steely slither, the sword slid out of his body. But the fire the blade had ignited within him did not go out. He clutched the gaping wound, and blue flame spurted out between his fingers, spattering in little burning pools among the rotting stones about him. His maimed face, still streaked with fiery tears, contorted in agony. He lifted that burning face to the heaving sky and raised his vast arms. In mortal anguish, the stricken god cried to heaven, "Mother!" And the sound of his voice echoed from the farthest star. He stood so for a frozen moment, his arms upraised in supplication, and then he tottered. Then he fell dead at Geryon's feet. For an instant, there was absolute silence. Then a howling cry started at Torak's dead lips, fading into unimaginable distance as the dark prophecy fled, taking the inky shadow of Trachgoru with it. Again there was silence. The racing clouds overhead stopped at once in their maddest plunge, and the stars that had appeared among the tatters of that cloud went out. The entire universe shuddered and stopped. There was a moment of absolute darkness, as all light everywhere went out, and all motion ceased. In that dreadful instant, all that existed, all that had been, all that was yet to be, was wrenched suddenly into the course of one prophecy. Where there had always been two, there was now but one. And then, faint at first, the wind began to blow, purging away the rotten stink of the city of night, and the stars came on again like suddenly re-illuminated jewels on the velvety throat of night. As the light returned, Geryon stood wearily over the body of the god he had just killed. His sword still flickered blue in his hand, and the orb exulted in the vaults of his mind. Vaguely he was aware that in that shuddering moment, when all light had died, both he and Torak had returned to their normal size. But he was too tired to wonder about it. From the shattered tomb not far away, Belgarath emerged, shaken and drawn. The broken chain of his medallion dangled from his tightly clenched hand, and he stopped to stare for a moment at Geryon and the fallen god. The wind moaned in the shattered ruins, and somewhere, far off in the night, the hounds of Torak howled a mournful dirge for their fallen master. Belgarath straightened his shoulders. Then, in a gesture peculiarly like that which Torak had made in the moment of his death, he raised his arms to the sky.
"Master,"
he cried out in a huge voice,
"it is finished."
Chapter 24. It was over. But there was a bitterness in the taste of Geryon's victory. A man did not lightly kill a god, no matter how twisted or evil that god might be. And so, Belgariad of Reva stood sadly over the body of his fallen enemy, as the wind, smelling faintly of the approaching dawn, washed over the decaying ruins of the city of night.
"Regrets, Geryon?"
Belgarath asked quietly, putting his hand on his grandson's shoulder. Geryon sighed. "No, grandfather. I suppose not. Not really. It had to be done, didn't it?"
Belgarath nodded gravely.
"It's just that he was so alone at the end. I took everything away from him before I killed him. I'm not very proud of that."
"As you say, it had to be done. It was the only way you could beat him."
"I just wish I could have left him something, that's all." From the ruins of the shattered iron tower, a sad little procession emerged. Aunt Paul, Silk, and Tinedra were bringing out the body of Dernick the smith, and walking gravely beside them came Errand. A pang of almost unbearable grief ran through Geryon. Dernick, his oldest friend, was pale and dead, and in that vast internal upheaval that had preceded the duel with Torak, Geryon had not even been able to mourn.
"It was necessary, you understand,"
Belgarath said sadly. "Why? Why did Dernick have to die, grandfather?" Geryon's voice was anguished, and tears stood openly in his eyes.
"Because his death gave your Aunt Paul the will to resist Torak. That has always been the one flaw in the prophecy. The possibility that Paul might yield. All Torak needed was one person to love him. It would have made him invincible."
"What would have happened if she had gone to him?"
"You would have lost the fight. That's why Dernick had to die."
The old man sighed regretfully.
"I wish it could have been otherwise. But it was inevitable."
The three who had borne Dernick from the broken tomb gently laid his still form on the ground, and Tinedra sadly joined Belgarath and Geryon. Wordlessly, the tiny girl slipped her hand into Geryon's, and the three of them stood silently watching as Aunt Paul, past tears now, gently straightened Dernick's arms at his sides, and then covered him with her cloak. She sat then upon the earth, took his head into her lap and almost absently stroked his hair, her head bowed over his in her grief.
"I cannot bear it,"
Sinedra suddenly sobbed, and she buried her face in Gerion's shoulder and began to weep. Then there was a light where there had been only darkness before. As Gerion stared, a single beam of brilliant blue light descended from the broken and tattered cloud rolling overhead. The entire ruin seemed bathed in its intense radiance as the light touched the earth. Like a great glowing column, the beam of light reached down to the earth from the night sky, and was joined by other beams, red and yellow and green, and shades Gerion could not even name. Like the colors at the foot of a sudden rainbow, the great columns of light stood side by side on the other side of Torak's fallen body. Then, indistinctly, Gerion perceived that a glowing incandescent figure stood within the center of each column of light. The gods had returned to mourn the passing of their brother. Gerion recognized Aldur, and he could easily identify each of the others. Mara still wept, and dead-eyed Issa seemed to undulate in his serpent-like manner as he stood within his glowing column of pale green light. Nedra's face was shrewd, and Kaldan's proud. Balar, the blond-haired, boyish god of the Elorns, had a roguish, impudent look about him, though his face, like those of his brothers, was sad at the death of Torak. The gods had returned to earth in glowing light, and with sound as well. The reeking air of Kol Mishrak was suddenly alive with that sound, as each colored beam of light gave off a different note, the notes joining in a harmony so profound that it seemed the answer to every question that had ever been asked. Finally, joining the other columns of light, a single blindingly white beam slowly descended, and within the center of that radiance stood the white-robed form of Ul, that strange god whom Gerion had seen once in Prolgu. The figure of Aldur, still embraced in its glowing blue nimbus, approached the ancient god of Ulgo. "Father," Aldur said sadly, "our brother, thy son Torak, is slain." Shimmering and incandescent, the form of Ul, father of the other gods, moved across the rubble-strewn ground to stand over the silent body of Torak. "I tried to turn thee from this path, my son," he said softly, and a single tear coursed its way down his eternal cheek. Then he turned back to Aldur. "Take up the form of thy brother, my son. Place it upon some more suitable resting place. It grieves me to see him lie so low upon the earth." Aldur, joined by his brethren, took up the body of Torak and placed it upon a large block of stone lying amid the ancient ruins. Then, standing in a quiet, gleaming circle about the bier, they mourned the passing of the god of Engerak. Unafraid as always, seemingly not even aware that the glowing figures which had descended from the sky were not human, Errand walked quite confidently to the shining form of Ul. He reached out his small hand and tugged insistently at the god's robe.
"Father?"
he said. Ul looked down at the small face.
"Father?"
Errand repeated, perhaps echoing Aldur, who had, in his use of that name, revealed at last the true identity of the god of Ulgo.
"Father?"
the little boy said again. Then he turned and pointed at the silent form of Dernick.
"Errand."
It was in some strange way more a command than a request. The face of Ul became troubled. "It is not possible, child."
"Father?"
the little boy insisted.
"Errand."
Ul looked inquiringly at Gerion, his eyes profoundly unsettled. "The child's request is serious," he said gravely, speaking not to Gerion, but to that other awareness. "And it places an obligation upon me, but it crosses the uncrossable boundary." "The boundary must remain intact," the dry voice replied through Gerion's lips.
Thy sons are passionate, holy Ul, and having once crossed this line, they may be tempted to do so again, and perhaps in one such crossing they may change that which must not be changed. Let us not provide the instrumentality whereby destiny must once more follow two divergent paths. All sighed. Wilt thou and thy sons, however, lend of your power to my instrument, so that he may cross the boundary? All looked startled at that. Thus will the boundary be protected, and thine obligation shall be met. It can happen in no other way.
Let it be as thou wilt,
All agreed. He turned then, and a peculiar look passed between the father of the gods and his eldest son, Aldur. Aldur, still bathed in blue light, turned from his sad contemplation of his dead brother toward Aunt Paul, who was still bowed over Dernick's body.
"Be comforted, my daughter," he told her. "His sacrifice was for thee, and for all mankind."
"That is slight comfort, master," she replied, her eyes full of tears. "This was the best of men."
"All men die, my daughter, the best as well as the worst. In thy life thou hast seen this many times."
"Yes, master, but this is different."
"In what way, beloved Polgara?"
Aldur seemed to be pressing her for some reason. Aunt Paul bit her lip. "Because I loved him, master," she replied finally. The faintest touch of a smile appeared on Aldur's lips.
"Is that so difficult to say, my daughter?"
She could not answer, but bowed again over Dernick's lifeless form.
"Wouldst thou have us restore this man to thee, my daughter?"
Aldur asked then. Her face came up sharply. "That isn't possible, master. Please, don't toy with my grief like this."
"Let us, however, consider that it may be possible. Wouldst thou have us restore him?"
"With all my heart, master."
"To what end? What task hast thou for this man that demands his restoration?"
She bit her lip again.
to be my husband, master,"
she blurted finally, with a trace of defiance in her voice.
And was that also so very difficult to say? Art thou sure, however, that this love of thine derives not from thy grief, and that once this good man is restored, thy mind might not turn away from him? He is, thou must admit, most ordinary.
Dernick has never been ordinary, she flared with sudden heat. He is the best and bravest man in the world.
I meant him no disrespect, Bolgra, but no power doth infuse him. The force of the will and the word is not in him.
Is that so important, master?
Marriage must be a joining of equals, my daughter. How could this good, brave man be husband to thee, so long as thy power remains?
She looked at him helplessly.
Couldst thou, Polgara, limit thyself? Wouldst thou become his equal, with power no more than his?
She stared at him, hesitated, then blurted the one word.
Yes.
Geryon was shocked, not so much by Aunt Paul's acceptance, but rather by Aldur's request. Aunt Paul's power was central to her very being. To remove it from her would leave her with nothing. What would she be without it? How could she even live without it? It was a cruel price to demand, and Geryon had believed that Aldur was a kindly god.
I will accept thy sacrifice, Bolgara, Aldur was saying. I will speak with my father and my brothers, For good and proper reasons, we have denied ourselves this power, and we must all agree to it before any of us might attempt this violation of the natural order of things." And he returned to the sorrowful gathering about Torak's bear.
"How could he do that?"
His arm still about Tenedra, Geryon demanded his question of his grandfather.
"Do what?"
"Ask her to give up her powers like that. Won't it destroy her?"
"She is much stronger than you think, Geryon,"
Belgarath assured him.
"And Alder's reasoning is sound. No marriage could survive that kind of inequality."
Among the glowing gods, however, one angry voice was raised. "No!" It was Mara, the weeping god of the Marags, who were no more. "Why should one man be restored, when all my slaughtered children still lie cold and dead? Did Aldur hear my pleas? Did he come to my aid when my children died? I will not consent."
"I hadn't counted on that,"
Belgarath muttered.
"I had better take steps before this goes any further."
He crossed the littered ground and bowed respectfully.
"Forgive my intrusion," he said, "but would my master's brother accept a woman of the Marags as a gift in exchange for his aid in restoring Dernick?"
Mara's tears, which had been perpetual, suddenly stopped, and his face became incredulous. "A Marag woman? None such exist. I would have known in my heart if one of my children had survived in Maragor."
"Of a certainty, Lord Mara,"
Belgarath agreed quickly.
"But what of those few who were carried out of Maragor to dwell in perpetual slavery?"
"Knowest thou of such a one, Belgarath?" Mara asked with a desperate eagerness. The old man nodded.
"We discovered her in the slave pens beneath Rachthal, Lord Mara. Her name is Taiba. She is but one, but a race may be restored by such a one as she, particularly if she be watched over by a loving god."
"Where is Taiba, my daughter?"
"In the care of Relg, the Ulgo," Belgarath replied. "They seem quite attached to each other."
Mara looked at him thoughtfully. "A race may not be restored by one, even in the care of the most loving god. It requires two." He turned to Ul. "Wilt thou give me this Ulgo, father? He shall become the sire of my people." Ul gave Belgarath a rather penetrating look.
"Thou knowest that Relg hath another duty to perform,"
he said pointedly. Belgarath's expression was almost impish.
"I am certain the Gorum and I can work out the details most wholly,"
he declared with utmost self-confidence. "Aren't you forgetting something, Belgarath?" Silk asked diffidently, as if not wanting to intrude. "Relg has this little problem, remember?" Belgarath gave the little man a hard look. I thought I ought to mention it," Silk said innocently. Mara looked sharply at them. "What is this?"
"A minor difficulty, Lord Mara,"
Belgarath said quickly.
"One that I'm certain Taiba can overcome. I have the utmost confidence in her in that particular area."
"I will have the truth of this," Mara said firmly. Belgarath sighed and gave Silk another grim look.
"Relg is a zealot, Lord Mara. For religious reasons, he avoids certain, forms of human contact."
"Fatherhood is his destiny," Ul said. "From him will issue a special child. I will explain this to him. He is an obedient man, and he will put aside his aversions for my sake." "Then thou wilt give him to me, father?" Mara asked eagerly.
"He is thine, with but one restriction, of which we will speak later."
"Let us see to this brave Sendar, then," Mara said, and all traces of his weeping were now gone.
Belgariad,
the voice in Gerion's mind said.
What? The restoration of your friend is in your hands now.
Me?
Why me? Must you always say that? Do you want Dernick's life restored?
Well, of course, but I can't do it. I wouldn't even know where to begin.
You did it before. Remember the colt in the cave of the gods?
Gerion had almost forgotten that.
You are my instrument, Belgariad. I can keep you from making mistakes. Most of the time, anyway. Just relax. I'll show you what to do.
Gerion was already moving without conscious volition. He let his arms fall from about Cenedra's shoulders, and his sword still in his hand, he walked slowly toward Aunt Paul and Dernick's body. He looked once into her eyes as she sat with the dead man's head in her lap, and then he knelt beside the body.
"For me, Gerion," she murmured to him.
"If I can, Aunt Paul."
Then, without knowing why, he laid the sword of the Raven King upon the ground, and took hold of the orb at its pommel. With a faint click, the orb came free in his hand. Errand, smiling now, approached from the other side, and also knelt. Taking up Dernick's lifeless hand in his, holding the orb in both hands, Gerion reached out and put it against the dead man's chest. He was faintly conscious of the fact that the gods had gathered about in a circle, and that they had reached out their arms, palm to palm, forming an unbroken ring. Within that circle, a great light began to pulsate, and the orb, as if in answer, glowed between his hands. The blank wall he had seen once before was there again, still black, impenetrable, silent. As he had before in the cave of the gods, Gerion pushed tentatively against the substance of death itself, striving to reach through and pull his friend back into the world of the living. It was different this time. The colt he had brought to life in the cave had never lived except within its mother's body. Its death had been as tenuous as its life, and it lay but a short distance beyond the barrier. Dernick, however, had been a man full-grown, and his death, like his life, was far more profound. With all of his strength, Gerion pushed. He could feel the enormous force of the combined wills of the gods joining with his in the silent struggle, but the barrier would not yield. "Use the orb," the voice commanded. This time Gerion focused all the power, his own and that of the gods, upon the round stone between his hands. It flickered, then glowed, then flickered again. "Help me," Gerion commanded it. As if suddenly understanding, the orb flared into a coruscating eruption of colored light. The barrier was weakening. With an encouraging little smile, Errand reached out and laid one hand upon the blazing orb. The barrier broke. Dernick's chest heaved, and he coughed once. With profoundly respectful expressions upon their eternal faces, the gods stepped back. Aunt Paul cried out in sudden relief, and clasped her arms about Dernick, cradling him against her.
"Errand,"
the child said to Gerion, with a peculiar note of satisfaction. Gerion stumbled to his feet, exhausted by the struggle, and nearly staggering as he moved away.
"Are you all right?"
Cenedra demanded of him, even as she ducked her head beneath his arm and firmly pulled it about her tiny shoulders. He nodded, though his knees almost buckled.
"Lean on me,"
she told him. He was about to protest, but she put her hand firmly to his lips.
"Don't argue, Gerion," she told him. "You know that I love you, and that you're going to be leaning on me for the rest of your life anyway, so you might as well get used to the idea."
"I think my life's going to be different now, Master,"
Belgarath was saying to Alder.
"Paul has always been there, ready to come when I called her. Not always willingly, perhaps, but she always came. Now she'll have other concerns." He sighed. "I suppose our children all grow up and get married sometime." "This particular pose doth not become thee, my son," Alder told him.
Belgarath grinned.
"I have never been able to slip anything past you, master," he said.
Then his face grew serious again.
"Olga has been almost like a son to me," he told Alder. "But perhaps it is time that I let her be a woman. I have denied her that for too long." "As it seemeth best to thee, my son," Alder said. "And now, I pray thee, go apart a little way, and permit us our family grief."
He looked at Torak's body lying on the bier, and then at Geryon.
"I have but one more task for thee, Belgariad. Take the orb, and place it upon my brother's breast."
"Yes, master," Geryon replied immediately. He removed his arm from around Senedra's shoulders and walked to the bier, trying not to look at the dead god's seared and twisted face. He reached out and laid the round blue stone upon the motionless chest of Kal Torak. Then he stepped back. Once again his little princess wormed her way beneath his arm and clasped him about the waist. It was not unpleasant, but he had the brief, irrational thought that things would be awkward if she was going to insist on this close embrace for the rest of their lives. Once again the gods formed their circle, and once again the orb began to glow. Gradually, the seared face started to change, its maiming slowly disappearing. The light surrounding the gods and the bier grew stronger, and the glow of the orb became incandescent. The last Geryon saw of the face of Torak, it was calm, composed, and unmarked. It was a beautiful face, but it was nonetheless still a dead face. And then the light grew so intense that Geryon could no longer look at it. When it subsided, and when Geryon looked back at the bier, the gods and the body of Torak were gone. Only the orb remained, glowing slightly as it lay there on the rough stone. Arand once again, with that confident look, went to the bier. Standing on his tiptoes, he reached across the block to retrieve the glowing stone. Then he carried it to Geryon.
"Arand, Belgariad,"
he said firmly, handing the orb back, and in their touch, as the orb exchanged hands, Geryon felt something profoundly different. Drawn together by what had happened, the little group silently gathered about Aunt Paul and Dernick. To the east, the sky had begun to lighten, and the rosy blush of dawn touched the few last remaining tatters of the cloud that had covered Clol Mishrak. The events of the dreadful night had been titanic, but now the night was nearly over, and they stood together, not speaking, as they watched the arrival of the dawn. The storm that had raged through the long night had passed. For years beyond counting, the universe had been divided against itself, but now it was one again. If there were such things as beginnings, this was a beginning. And so it was, through broken cloud, that the sun rose on the morning of the first day. Epilogue. The Isle of the Winds. Chapter 25. Belgariad of Reba slept very fitfully the night before his wedding. Had he and Senedra been married in some simple, private little ceremony shortly after his meeting with Torak, things might have gone more smoothly. At that time, both he and his flighty little princess had been too tired and too overwhelmed by the events which had taken place to be anything but absolutely honest with each other. During those few short days he had found her to be almost a different person. She had watched his every move with a kind of patient adoration, and she was forever touching him, his hair, his face, his arms, her fingers gentle and curious. The peculiar way she had of coming up to him, no matter who was present or what was going on, and worming her way into the circle of his arm had been, on the whole, rather nice. Those days had not, however, lasted. Once she had reassured herself that he was all right, and that he was really there and not some figment of her imagination which might be snatched away at any moment, Zenedra had gradually changed. He felt somehow like a possession. Following her initial delight in ownership, his princess had rather deliberately embarked upon some grand plan of alteration. And now, the day upon which her possession of him was to be formalized was only hours away. His sleep came in fits and starts, with dreams mingling peculiarly with memories as he dipped in and out of sleep like a seabird skimming across the waves. He was at Faldor's farm again. Even in his sleep he could hear the ringing of Dernick's hammer, and the smell and the odor coming from Aunt Paul's kitchen was there. Rundrig was there too, and Zubret and Dorun, and there was Brill creeping around a corner. He half awoke and turned restlessly in the royal bed. That wasn't possible. Dorun was dead, drowned in the River Mardu, and Brill had vanished forever over the parapet of a mile-high Rakthal. And then he was in the palace of Stithistor, and Salmisra, her blatant nudity glowing through her filmy gown, was touching his face with her cold fingers. But Salmisra was no longer a woman. He had watched her himself as she had changed into a serpent. Groll the Eldrak hammered at the frozen ground with his iron-shod club, bellowing, "Come, Grat, fight!" and Zenedra was screaming. In the chaotic world of dreams half-mixed with memories, he saw Ktuchik, his face contorted with horror, exploding once more into nothingness in the hanging turret at Rachtal. And then he stood once again in the decaying ruin of Skolmishrak, his sword ablaze, and he watched as Torak raised his arms to the rolling cloud, weeping tears of fire, and once again heard the stricken god's final cry of Mother. He stirred, half-rousing, and shuddering as he always did when that dream recurred, but dipped almost immediately into sleep again. He was standing on the deck of Barak's ship just off of the Mallorean coast, listening as King Anheg explained why Barak was chained to the mast. "We had to do it," the coarse-faced monarch was saying mournfully to Belgarath. "Right during the middle of the storm he turned into a bear. He drove the crew to row toward Mallorea all night long. Then, just before daybreak, he turned back into a man again." "Unchain him, Anheg," Belgarath said disgustedly. "He's not going to turn into a bear again, not as long as Gerion's safe and well." Gerion rolled over and sat up. That had been a startling revelation. There had been a purpose behind Barak's periodic alterations. "You are Gerion's defender," Belgarath had explained to the big man. "That's why you were born. Any time Gerion was in mortal danger, you changed into a bear in order to protect him." "You mean to say that I'm a sorcerer?" Barak had demanded incredulously. "Hardly. The shape change isn't all that difficult. And you didn't do it consciously. The prophecy did the work, not you." Barak had spent the rest of the voyage back to Mishrakachtal trying to come up with a tastefully understated way to add that concept to his coat of arms. Gerion climbed out of his high canopied bed and went to the window. The stars in the spring sky looked down at the sleeping city of Raven and at the dark waters of the Sea of the Winds beyond the harbor. There was no sign that dawn was anywhere near yet. Gerion sighed, poured himself a drink of water from the pitcher on the table, and went back to bed and to his troubled sleep. He was at Tolzelek, and Hetar and Mandoralan were reporting on the activities of Zakath, the Mallorean emperor.
"He is laying siege to Rakgoska now,"
hawk-faced Hetar was saying. There had been a peculiar softening in Hetar's face since Gerion had last seen him, as if something very significant had happened. The tall Algar turned to Gerion.
"Eventually, you're going to have to do something about Zakath. I don't think you want him roaming around at will in this part of the world."
"Why me?" Gerion asked without thinking.
"You are Overlord of the West, remember?"
Once again Gerion awoke. Sooner, of late, he would have to deal with Zakath. There was no question about that. Maybe after the wedding he would have time to consider the matter. That thought, however, stopped him. Strangely, he had no conception of anything that might happen after the wedding. It stood before him like some huge door that led into a place he had never been. Zakath would have to wait. Geryon had to get through the wedding first. Half asleep, somewhere between dreaming and remembering, Geryon relived a significant little exchange between himself and Her Imperial Highness. "It is stupid, Zenedra. I'm not going to fight anybody, so why should I ride in waving my sword?"
"They deserve to see you, Geryon," she explained, as if talking to a child. "They left their homes and rode into battle at your summons."
"I didn't summon anybody."
"I did it on your behalf. They're a very good army, really, and I raised them all by myself. Aren't you proud of me?"
"I didn't ask you to do that."
"You were too proud to ask. That's one of your failings, Geryon. You must never be so proud to ask the people who love you for help. Every man in the army loves you. They followed me because of you. Is it too much trouble for the great overlord of the West to reward his faithful soldiers with just a little bit of a display of appreciation? Or have you become too grand and lofty for simple gratitude?"
"You're twisting things, Zenedra. You do that a lot, you know." But Zenedra had already moved on, as if the entire matter were settled.
"And of course you will wear your crown. Oh, and some nice armor. I think a mail shirt would be appropriate."
"I am not going to make a clown of myself just to satisfy your urges toward cheap theatricality." Her eyes filled. Her lower lip trembled.
"You don't love me any more,"
she accused him in a quavering little voice. Geryon groaned, even in his sleep. It always came down to that. She won every single argument with that artful bit of deception. He knew it was not genuine. He knew that she only did it to get her own way. But he was absolutely defenseless against it. It might have nothing whatsoever to do with the matter under discussion, but she always managed to twist things around until she could unleash that devastating accusation. And all hope of his winning, even the smallest point, was immediately lost. Where had she learned to be so heartlessly dishonest? And so it was that Geryon, dressed in mail, wearing his crown and self-consciously holding his flaming sword aloft, had ridden into the forts atop the eastern escarpment to the thunderous cheers of Zenedra's army. So much had happened since Geryon and Silk and Belgarath had crept from the citadel at Riva the previous spring. The young king lay musing in his high-canopied bed, having almost given up on sleep. Zenedra had, in fact, raised an army. As he had heard more of the details, he had been more and more astonished, not only by her audacity, but also by the enormous amount of energy and sheer will she had expended in the process. She had been guided and assisted, certainly, but the initial concept had been hers. His admiration for her was tinged slightly with apprehension. He was going to marry a very strong-minded young woman, and one who was not overly troubled by scruples. He rolled over and punched at his pillow, hoping somehow, by that familiar act, to bring on more normal sleep. But once again he slipped into restless dreaming. Relg and Taiba were walking toward him, and they were holding hands. And then he was at the stronghold, sitting at Adara's bedside. His beautiful cousin was even paler than he remembered, and she had a persistent racking cough. Even as the two of them talked, Aunt Paul was taking steps to remedy the last complications of the wound which had so nearly claimed the girl's life.
"I was mortified, of course,"
Adara was saying.
"I'd taken so much care to conceal it from him, and now I had gone and blurted it out to him, and I wasn't even dying."
"Hetar?" Geryon said again. He had already said it 3 times.
"If you don't stop that, Geryon, I'm going to be very cross with you."
Adara said it quite firmly, under the circumstances. "I'm sorry," he apologized quickly. It's just that I've never considered him in that light. Oh, he's a good friend, but I never thought of him as particularly lovable. He's so, well, I don't know, implacable, I suppose?
I have certain reasons to believe that may change,
Adara said with a faint blush. Then she began to cough again. "Drink this, dear," Aunt Paul ordered, coming to the bedside with a fuming cup. "It's going to taste awful," Geryon warned his cousin. "That will do, Geryon," Aunt Paul told him. "I can manage this without the helpful comments." And then he was in the caves beneath Prolgu, standing beside Relg as the Gorim performed the simple ceremony, uniting the zealot and the Marag woman, who had so totally changed Relg's life. Geryon sensed another presence in the underground chamber, and he wondered if anyone had yet told Relg about the bargain that had been struck in Tol Mishrak. He'd thought about saying something himself, but had decided against it. All things considered, it might be best to let Relg adjust to one thing at a time. Marriage to Taiba was probably going to be enough of a shock to the fanatic system for now. Geryon could feel Mera's gloating exultation as the ceremony concluded. The weeping god no longer wept. It was useless, Geryon decided. He was not going to be able to sleep, at least not the kind of sleep that would do him any good. He threw off the covers and pulled on his robe. The fire in his fireplace had been banked for the night, and he stirred it up again. Then he sat in the chair in front of it, staring pensively into the dancing flames. Even if his wedding to Tsenedra had taken place immediately upon their arrival back at Reva, things might still have turned out all right. But the arrangements for a royal wedding of this magnitude were far too complex to be made overnight, and many of those who were to be honored guests were still recuperating from wounds received during the Battle of Tolmardu. The interim had given Tsenedra time to embark upon a full-blown plan of modification. She had, it appeared, a certain concept of him, some ideal which only she could perceive, and she was absolutely determined to cram him into that mold, despite all of his objections and protests. Nothing could make her relent in her single-minded drive to make him over. It was so unfair. He was quite content to accept her exactly as she was. She had her flaws, many of them. But he was willing to take the good with the bad. Why couldn't she extend him the same courtesy? But each time he tried to put his foot down and absolutely refuse one of her whims, her eyes would fill with tears, her lip would tremble, and the fatal, "You don't love me any more?" would drop quaveringly upon him. Belgariad of Reva had considered flight several times during that long winter. Now it was spring again, and the storms which isolated the Isle of the Winds during the winter months were past. The day which Geryon felt would never come had suddenly rushed upon him. Today was the day in which he would take the imperial princess Tsenedra to wife, and it was too late to run. He knew that if he brooded about it much longer, he would push himself over the edge into total panic, and so he stood up and quickly dressed himself in plain tunic and hose, ignoring the more ostentatious garments which his valet, at Tsenedra's explicit instructions, had laid out for him. It was about an hour before daylight as the young king of Reva opened the door to the royal apartment and slipped into the silent corridor outside. He wandered for a time through the dim, empty halls of the citadel, and then, inevitably, his undirected steps led him to Aunt Paul's door. She was already awake and seated by her fire with a cup of fragrant tea in her hands. She wore a deep blue dressing gown, and her dark hair flowed down across her shoulders in a lustrous wave. "You're up early," she noted. "I couldn't sleep." "You should have. You have a very full day ahead of you." "I know. That's why I couldn't sleep." "Tea?" "No, thanks." He sat in the carved chair on the other side of the fireplace. "Everything has changed, Aunt Paul," he said after a moment of thoughtful silence. "After today, nothing will ever be the same again, will it?" "Probably not," she said. "But that doesn't necessarily mean that it will be a change for the worse."
How do you feel about the idea of getting married?"
"A bit nervous," she admitted calmly.
"You? I have never been married before either, Geryon."
Something had been bothering him about that.
"Was it really such a good idea, Aunt Paul? I mean, arranging to have you and Dernick get married on the same day as Senedra and I. Well, what I'm trying to say is that you are the most important woman in the world. Shouldn't your wedding be a special occasion?" "That was what we were trying to avoid, Geryon," she replied. "Dernick and I decided that we wanted our wedding to be private, and we hope that it will be lost in all of the confusion and ceremony that's going to surround yours." "Well, how is he? I haven't seen him for several days now." "He's still a bit strange. I don't think he will ever be the same man we all knew." "He's all right, though, isn't he?" Geryon's question was concerned. "He's fine, Geryon. He's just a bit different, that's all. Something happened to him that has never happened to any other man, and it changed him. He's as practical as ever, but now he looks at the other side of things as well. I think I rather like that." "Do you really have to leave Reva?" he asked suddenly. "You and Dernick could stay here in the Citadel. We want our own place, Geryon. We need to be alone with each other. Besides, if I were here every time you and Senedra had a squabble, I'd have one or the both of you hammering on my door. I have done my best to raise you two. Now you are going to have to work things out on your own." "Where will you go?" "To the Vale. My mother's cottage is still there. It is a very solid house. All it needs is new thatching on the roof and new doors and windows. Dernick knows how to take care of that. And it will be a good place for Erend to grow up." "Erend? You're taking him with you?" "Someone has to care for him, and I have grown used to having a small boy around. And besides, Father and I have decided that we would like for him to be some distance from the orb. He is still the only one besides you who can touch it. Someone at some time might seize upon that and try to use him in the same way Zadar did." "What would be the point? I mean, Torak's gone now. What good would the orb do anybody else?" She looked at him very gravely, and the white lock of her brow seemed to glow in the soft light. "I don't believe that was the only reason for the orb's existence, Geryon," she told him seriously. "Something hasn't been completed yet." "What? What else is there left to do?" "We don't know. The Marin Codex does not end with meeting between the Child of Light and the Child of Dark. You are the guardian of the orb now, and it is still as important as ever, so don't just put it on the back shelf of a closet somewhere and forget about it. Be watchful and don't let ordinary affairs dull your mind. Keeping the orb is still your first duty, and I am not going to be here to remind you about it every day." He did not want to think about that. "What will you do if somebody comes to the Vale and tries to take Erend away? You won't be able to protect him now that—" He faltered to a stop. He had not spoken to her about that. "Go ahead. Say it, Geryon. Let's look it right in the face. You were going to say now that I no longer have any power. What's it like, Aunt Paul? Is it like losing something, a sort of emptiness, maybe?" "I feel the same as always, dear. Of course, I haven't tried to do anything since I agreed to give it up. It might be painful if I tried to make something happen and failed. I don't think I'd care for the experience, so I simply have not tried." She shrugged. "That part of my life is over. So I'll just have to put it behind me. Erend will be safe, though. Belden is in the Vale and the twins. That is enough power in one place to keep away anything that might want to harm him." "Why is Dernick spending so much time with Grandfather?" Geryon asked suddenly. "Ever since we got back to Reva, they've been together just about every minute of the day." She gave him a knowing smile. "I imagine they are preparing some surprise for me, Some suitable wedding present? They both tend to be a trifle transparent." "What is it?" "I haven't the slightest idea, and I would not dream of trying to find out. Whatever it is, they have both worked too hard at it for me to spoil it for them by snooping around." She glanced at the window where the first light of dawn was appearing. "Perhaps you'd better run along now, dear," she suggested. "I have to start getting ready. This is a very special day for me, too, and I really want to look my best." "You could never look anything less than beautiful, Aunt Paul," he told her sincerely. "Why, thank you, Geryon." She smiled at him, looking somehow almost girlish. "But I would rather not take the chance." She gave him an appraising glance and touched his cheek. "Why don't you visit the baths, dear, and wash your hair, and get someone to shave you?" "I can do that myself, Aunt Paul." "That's not a good idea, Geryon. You are a little too nervous today, and you don't want to put a razor to your face when your hands are trembling." He laughed a bit ruefully, kissed her, and started toward the door. Then he stopped and turned back toward her. "I love you, Aunt Paul," he said simply. "Yes, dear, I know. I love you, too."
After he had visited the baths, Geryon went looking for Luldaran. Among the matters that had finally been settled was the marital status of the young Asturian and his semi-official bride. Ariana had finally despaired of Luldaran's ever making the first move on his own, and had solved the entire problem by simply moving in with him. She had been quite firm about it. Geryon gathered that Luldaran's resistance had faded rather quickly. His expression of late had been somewhat more foolish than usual, and Ariana's had been, although radiant, just a trifle smug. In a peculiar way, they closely resembled Relg and Taiba in that respect. Since his wedding, Relg's expression had been one of almost perpetual astonishment, while Taiba's had that same smugness that marked Ariana's. Geryon wondered if he might not awaken tomorrow morning to see that self-same satisfied little smirk on Senedra's lips. There was a purpose to Geryon's search for his Asturian friend. As a result of one of Senedra's whims, their wedding was going to be followed by a grand ball, and Luldaran had been teaching Geryon how to dance. The idea of the ball had been greeted with enthusiasm by all of the ladies. The men, however, had not been universal in their approval. Barak had been particularly vehement in his objections.
"You want me to get in the middle of the floor and dance?"
he had demanded of the princess in an outraged tone.
"What's wrong with all of us just getting drunk? That's the normal way to celebrate a wedding."
"You'll be just fine,"
Senedra had told him, patting his cheek in that infuriating way of hers.
"And you will do it, won't you, Barak? For me?"
And she had insincerely fluttered her eyelashes at him. Barak had stamped away, muttering curses under his breath. Geryon found Luldaran and Ariana doting on each other across the breakfast table in their rooms.
"Wilt thou take breakfast with us, your majesty?"
Ariana inquired politely.
"Thanks all the same, my lady,"
Geryon declined.
"But I don't seem to have much appetite today."
"It is nerves," Luldaran observed sagely.
"I think I have got most of it."
Geryon rushed to the core of his problem.
"But that crossover baffles me. My feet keep getting all tangled up."
Luldaran immediately fetched a lute, and with Ariana's help, walked Geryon through the complex procedure.
"Thou art becoming more skilled, your majesty,"
Ariana complimented him at the end of the lesson. "All I want to do is get through it without tripping and falling on my face in public."
"The princess would surely support thee, shouldst thou stumble."
"I'm not sure about that. She might enjoy watching me make a fool of myself."
"Oh, how little thou knowest of women."
Ariana gave Luldaran an adoring look, a look he fatuously returned. "Will you two stop that?" Geryon demanded irritably. "Can't you wait until you're alone to carry on that way?"
"Oh, my heart is too full of love for me to hide it, Geryon,"
Luldaran said extravagantly.
"So I've noticed,"
Geryon said dryly. I've got to go see Silk, so I'll leave you two to your amusements." Ariana blushed, then smiled.
"Might we take that as a royal command, your majesty?"
she asked archly. Geryon fled. Silk had arrived from the east late the previous evening, and Geryon was anxious for news. He found the little Drasnian lingering over a breakfast of partridge and hot-spiced wine. "Isn't that a little heavy for breakfast?" Geryon asked him.
"I have never been that partial to gruel first thing in the morning," Silk replied. "Gruel is the sort of thing a man has to work himself up to."
Geryon went directly to the point. "What's happening in Tormurgos?"
"Zakath is still laying siege to Rakoska," Silk reported. "He's transporting in more troops, though. It's pretty obvious that he's going to strike into southern Tormurgos as soon as the ground's firm enough to move an army."
"Are the Tolls with him?"
"Only a few. Most of them are concentrating on finding the few Grolums left in their kingdom. I always thought Tolls were a stupid people, but you'd be amazed at how creative they can be when it comes to finding new and interesting ways for Grolums to die."
"We're going to have to keep an eye on Zakath. I wouldn't want him to come creeping up on me from the south."
"I think you can count on him not to creep. He sent you a message of congratulations, incidentally."
"He did what?"
"Well, he is a civilized man, Geryon, and a politician. He was badly shaken by the fact that you killed Torak. I think he's actually afraid of you, so he wants to stay on your good side, at least until he finishes up in southern Tormurgos."
"Well, who's in command of the Murgos now that Tarogas is dead?"
"Urget, his third son by his second wife. Oh, there was the usual squabble over the succession by the various sons of Tar-Urgas's assorted wives. The fatalities were numerous, I understand."
"What kind of man is this Urget?"
"He's a schemer. I don't think he's any match for Zakath, but he will keep the Malloreans busy for 10 or 20 years. By then, Zakath may be too old and tired of war to give you any problems."
"Well, let's hope so."
"Oh, I almost forgot. Etar married your cousin last week."
"Adara? I thought she was ill."
"Not that much, apparently. They're coming to your wedding, along with Kohag and Silar."
"Is everybody getting married?"
Silk laughed. "Not me, my young friend. In spite of this universal plunge toward matrimony, I still haven't lost my senses. If worse comes to worse, I still know how to run. The Algar should arrive sometime this morning. They met Corodulan's entourage, and they're all coming together. Their ship was right behind mine when we left Kamar."
"Was Mandoralan with them?"
Silk nodded. "Along with the Baroness of Voebor. The Baron's still too much ill to travel. I think he's hoping that he will die, to leave the way clear for his wife and Mandoralan." Geryon sighed. "Don't let it make you unhappy, Geryon," Silk advised. "Arryns actually enjoy that kind of misery. Mandoralan's perfectly content to suffer nobly."
"Well, that's a rotten thing to say," Geryon accused the little man.
Silk shrugged. "Now I'm a rotten sort of person," he admitted.
"Where are you going after—"
Geryon left it hanging. "After I see you safely married," Silk suggested pleasantly. "As soon as I recover from all of the drinking I'll do tonight, I'll be off for Gorog Nodrak. There's a great deal of opportunity in the new situation there. I have been in contact with Yarblek. He and I are going to form a partnership."
"With Yarblek?"
"Oh, he's not so bad, if you keep an eye on him. And he is very shrewd. We'll probably do rather well together."
"I can imagine," Geryon laughed. "One of you is bad enough all by himself, but with the two of you acting together, no honest merchant's going to escape with his skin."
Silk grinned wickedly. "That was sort of what we had in mind."
"I imagine you'll get very rich."
"I suppose I could learn to live with that." Silk's eyes took on a distant look. "That's not really what it's all about, though. It is a game. The money is just a way of keeping score. It is the game that's important."
"It seems to me that you told me that once before."
"Nothing has changed since then, Geryon," Silk told him with a laugh.
And Paul's wedding to Dernick took place later that morning in a small private chapel in the west wing of the citadel. There were but a few guests. Belgarath and the twins, Beltira and Belkira, were of course there, and Silk and Barak. Aunt Paul, beautiful in a deep blue velvet gown, was attended by Queen Layla, and Geryon stood with Dernick. The ceremony was performed by the hunchbacked Belden, dressed for once in decent clothing and with a strangely gentle expression on his ugly face. Geryon's emotions were very complex during the ceremony. He realized with a sharp little pang that Aunt Paul would no longer be exclusively his. An elemental, childish part of him resented that. He was, however, pleased that it was Dernick whom she was marrying. If anyone deserved her, it was Dernick. The good, plain man's eyes were filled with absolute love, and he obviously could not take them from her face. Aunt Paul herself was gravely radiant as she stood at Dernick's side. As Geryon stepped back while the two exchanged vows, he heard a faint rustle. Just inside the door of the chapel, in a hooded cloak that covered her from head to foot, and wearing a heavy veil that covered her face, stood Princess Tynedra. She had made a large issue of the fact that by an ancient Tolnedran custom, Geryon was not supposed to see her before their wedding on this day, and the cloak and veil provided her with the illusion of invisibility. He could imagine her wrestling with the problem until she had come up with this solution. Nothing could have kept her from Polgara's wedding, but all of the niceties and formalities had to be observed. Geryon smiled slightly as he turned back toward the ceremony. It was the expression on Belden's face that made him turn again to look sharply toward the back of the chapel, an expression of surprise that turned to calm recognition. At first Geryon saw nothing, but then a faint movement up among the rafters caught his eye. The pale, ghostly shape of a snowy owl, perched on one of the dark beams, watching as Aunt Paul and Dernick were married. When the ceremony was concluded, and after Dernick had respectfully and rather nervously kissed his bride, the white owl spread her pinions to circle the chapel in ghostly silence. She hovered briefly, as if in silent benediction over the happy couple. Then, with two soft beats of her wings, she moved through the breathless air to Belgarath. The old sorcerer resolutely averted his eyes. "You may as well look at her, father," Aunt Paul told him. "She won't leave until you recognize her." Belgarath sighed then, and looked directly at the oddly luminous bird hovering in the air before him. "I still miss you," he said very simply, "even after all this time." The owl regarded him with her golden, unblinking eyes for a moment, then flickered and vanished. "What an absolutely astonishing thing," Queen Layla gasped. "We are an astonishing people, Layla," Aunt Paul replied. "And we have a number of peculiar friends and relatives." She smiled then, her arm closely linked in Dernick's. "Besides," she added with a twinkle in her eye, "you wouldn't really expect a girl to get married without her mother in attendance, would you?" Following the wedding, they all walked through the corridors of the citadel back to the central fortress and stopped outside the door of Aunt Paul's private apartment. Geryon was about to follow Silk and Barak as, after a few brief congratulations, they moved on down the hallway, but Belgarath put his hand on his grandson's arm. "Stay a moment," the old man said. "I don't think we should intrude, grandfather," Geryon said nervously. "We will only stay for a few minutes," Belgarath assured him. The old man's lips were actually quivering with a suppressed mirth. "There is something I want you to see." One of Aunt Paul's eyebrows raised questioningly as her father and Geryon followed her into the apartment. "Are we responding to some ancient and obscure custom, father?" "No, Paul," he replied innocently.
Geryon and I only want to toast your happiness, that's all."
"What exactly are you up to, old wolf?" she asked him, but her eyes had an amused look in them.
"Do I have to be up to something?"
"You usually are, father." She did, however, fetch 4 crystal goblets and a decanter of fine old Tolnedran wine.
"The 4 of us started all this together quite a long time ago," Belgarath recalled. "Perhaps, before we all separate, we should take a moment to remember that we have come a long way since then, and some rather strange things have happened to us. We've all changed in one way or another, I think."
"You haven't changed all that much, father," Aunt Paul said meaningfully. "Would you get to the point?" Belgarath's eyes were twinkling openly now with some huge suppressed mirth.
"Dernick has something for you," he said.
Dernick swallowed hard.
"Now?"
he asked Belgarath apprehensively.
Belgarath nodded. "I know how much you love beautiful things, like that bird over there,"
Dernick said to Aunt Paul, looking at the crystal wren Geryon had given her the previous year.
"I wanted to give you something like that, too, only I can't work in glass or in gemstones. I'm a metalsmith, so I have to work in steel."
He had been unwrapping something covered in plain cloth. What he produced, finally, was an intricately wrought steel rose, just beginning to open. The details were exquisite, and the flower glowed with a burnished life of its own.
"Why, Dernick,"
Aunt Paul said, genuinely pleased.
"How very lovely."
Dernick, however, did not give her the rose yet.
"It has no color, though,"
he noted a bit critically.
"And no fragrance."
He glanced nervously at Belgarath.
"Do it," the old man told him, "the way I showed you."
Dernick turned back to Aunt Paul, still holding the burnished rose in his hand.
"I really have nothing to give you, my Paul," he told her humbly, "except an honest heart. And this."
He held out the rose in his hand, and his face took on an expression of intense concentration. Geryon heard it very clearly. It was a familiar, rushing surge of whispered sound, filled with a peculiarly bell-like shimmer. The polished rose in Dernick's outstretched hand seemed to pulsate slightly, and then gradually it began to change. The outsides of the petals were as white as new snow, but the insides, where the flower was just opening, were a deep, blushing red. When Dernick finished, he held a living flower out to Aunt Paul, its petals beaded with dew. Aunt Paul gasped as she stared incredulously at the rose. It was unlike any flower that had ever existed. With a trembling hand, she took it from him, her eyes filled with sudden tears.
"How is it possible?"
she asked in an awed voice.
"Dernick's a very special man now," Belgarath told her. "So far as I know, he is the only man who ever died, then lived again. That could not help changing him, at least a little. But then I suspect there's always been a poet lurking under the surface of our good, practical friend. Maybe the only real difference is that he now has a new way of letting that poet out."
Dernick, looking just a bit embarrassed, touched the rose with a tentative finger.
"It does have one advantage, my Paul. Oh, the steel is still in it, so it won't ever fade or wilt. It'll stay just as it is now, even in the middle of winter. You'll have at least one flower."
"Oh, Dernick,"
she cried, embracing him. Dernick looked a bit abashed as he awkwardly returned her embrace.
"If you really like it, I could make you some others. A whole garden of them, I suppose. It's not really all that hard, once you get the hang of it."
Aunt Paul's eyes, however, had suddenly widened. With one arm still about Dernick, she turned slightly to look at the crystal wren perched upon its glass twig.
"Fly,"
she said, and the glowing bird spread its wings and flew to her outstretched hand. Curiously, it inspected the rose, dipped its beak into a dewdrop, then lifted its head and began to sing a trilling little song. Gently, Aunt Paul raised her hand aloft, and the crystal bird soared back to its glass twig. The echo of its song still hung in the silent air.
"I expect it's time for Geryon and me to be going,"
Belgariad said, his face rather sentimental and misty. Aunt Paul, however, had quite obviously realized something. Her eyes narrowed slightly, then went very wide. "Just a moment, old wolf," she said to Belgariad, with a faint hint of steel in her voice. "You knew about this from the very beginning, didn't you?"
"About what, Paul?"
he asked innocently. "That Dernic, that I—" For the first time in his life, Geryon saw her at a loss for words. "You knew," she flared.
"Naturally. As soon as Dernic woke up, I could feel something different in him. I'm surprised you didn't feel it yourself. I had to work with him a bit to bring it out, though."
"Why didn't you tell me?"
"You didn't ask, Paul."
You...
With an enormous effort, she gained control of herself.
"All of these months you let me go on thinking that my power was gone, and it was there all the time. It was still there. And you put me through all of that?"
"Oh, really, Paul? If you had just stopped to think, you'd have realized that you can't give it up like that. Once it's there, it's there."
"But our master said—"
Belgariad raised one hand.
"If you'll just stop and remember, Paul, all he really asked was if you would be willing to limit your independence in marriage and go through life with no more power than Dernic has. Since there's no way he could remove your power, he obviously had something else in mind."
"You let me believe—"
"I have no control over what you believe, Paul,"
he replied in his most reasonable tone of voice.
"You tricked me."
"No, Paul. You tricked yourself."
And then he smiled fondly at her.
"Now, before you go off into a tirade, think about it for a moment. All things considered, it didn't really hurt you, did it? And isn't it really nicer to find out about it this way?"
His smile became a grin.
"You can even consider it my wedding present to you, if you'd like."
She stared at him for a moment, obviously wanting to be cross about the whole thing, but the look he returned to her was impish. The confrontation between them had been obscure, but he had quite obviously won this time. Finally, no longer able to maintain even the fiction of anger, she laughed helplessly and put her hand affectionately on his arm.
"You are a dreadful old man, Father."
"I know," he admitted. "Coming, Geryon?"
Once they were in the hall outside, Belgariad began to chuckle.
"What's so funny?"
"I have been waiting for that moment for months," his grandfather said, still chortling. "Did you see her face when she finally realized what had happened? She's been moping around with that look of noble self-sacrifice for all of this time, and then she suddenly finds out that it was absolutely unnecessary."
His face took on a wicked little smirk.
"Your aunt has always been just a little too sure of herself, you know. Maybe it was good for her to go for a little while thinking that she was just an ordinary person. Might give her some perspective."
"She was right," Geryon laughed. "You are a dreadful old man."
Belgariad grinned. "Oh, one does one's best."
They went along the hallway to the royal apartment where the clothes Geryon was to wear for his wedding were already laid out.
"Grandfather,"
Geryon said, sitting down to pull off his boots,
"there is something I've been meaning to ask you. Just before Torak died, he called out to his mother."
Belgariad, tankard in hand, nodded.
"Who is his mother?"
"The universe," the old man replied.
"I don't understand."
Belgariad scratched thoughtfully at his short white beard.
"As I understand it, each of the gods began as an idea in the mind of Ol, the father of the gods. but it was the universe that brought them forth. It's very complicated. I don't understand it entirely myself. Anyway, as he was dying, Torak cried out to the one thing that he felt still loved him. He was wrong, of course. Ol and the other gods did still love him, even though they knew that he had become twisted and totally evil. And the universe grieved for him.
The universe?
Didn't you feel it? That instant when everything stopped and all the lights went out.
I thought that was just me.
No, Geryon. For that single instant, all the light of the universe went out, and everything stopped moving. Everything. Everywhere. A part of that was the grief of the universe for her dead son. Geryon thought about that.
He had to die, though, didn't he?
Belgariad nodded. It was the only way that things could get back on the right course. Torak had to die, so that things could go toward what they're supposed to do. Otherwise, everything would have ultimately wound up in chaos.
A sudden strange thought struck Geryon.
Grandfather, who is Erend?
I don't know, Belgariad replied. Perhaps he is just a strange little boy. Perhaps he's something else. You had probably better start changing clothes now.
I was trying not to think about that.
Oh, come now. This is the happiest day of your life.
Really?
It might help if you keep saying so to yourself.
By general consent, the Gorum of Ulgo had been selected to perform the ceremony, uniting Geryon and Tinedra in marriage. The frail, saintly old man had made the journey from Prolgu in short, easy stages, carried by litter through the caves of Sindaria, then conveyed in King Fulrak's royal carriage to the city of Sindar, and thence by ship to Reva. The revelation of the fact that the god of the Ulgos was the father of the other gods had struck theological circles like a thunderclap. Entire libraries of turgid philosophical speculation had instantly become obsolete, and priests everywhere now stumbled about in a state of shock. Grodeg, the high priest of Belar, fainted dead away at the news. The towering ecclesiastic, already crippled for life by the wounds he had received during the Battle of Tulmardu, did not take this final blow well. When he recovered from his swoon, his attendants found that his mind had reverted to childhood, and he spent his days now surrounded by toys and brightly colored bits of string. The royal wedding, of course, took place in the hall of the Raven King, and everyone was there. King Rodar was in crimson, King Anheg in blue, King Fulrak wore brown, and King Kohag the customary Algar black. Brand, the Raven warder, his face made even more somber by the death of his youngest son, was dressed in raven grey. There were other royal visitors as well. Ran Barun, the 23rd, in his gold-colored mantle, was strangely jovial as he bantered with the shaven-headed Tzadi. Oddly enough, the two of them got on well together. The possibilities of the new situation in the West appealed to them both, and they were obviously moving toward an accommodation of some sort. King Koradulan wore royal purple, and stood about with the other kings, although he spoke but little. The blow to his head during the Battle of Tulmaradu had affected his hearing, and the young king of Arindia was obviously uncomfortable in company. In the very center of the gathered monarchs stood King Drostelekhtun of Garagnadrak, wearing a curiously unattractive yellow doublet. The nervous, emaciated king of the Nadraks spoke in short little bursts, and when he laughed, there was a shrill quality in his voice. King Drosta made many arrangements that afternoon, some of which he even intended to honor. Belgariad of Riva, of course, did not participate in those discussions, which was probably just as well. The Raven King's mind was a trifle distracted at that moment. Dressed all in blue, he paced nervously in a nearby antechamber, where he and Laldaran awaited the fanfare which was to summon them into the great hall. "I wish this was all over," he said for the 6th time. "Just be patient, Geryon," Laldaran advised him again. "What are they doing out there?"
Probably waiting for word that Her Highness is ready. At this particular time, she's far more important than you are. That is the way of weddings, you know. You're the lucky one. You and Ariana just ran off and got married without all of this fuss.
Laldoran laughed ruefully.
I did not really escape it, Garion. Just postponed it for a while. All the preparations here have inflamed my Ariana. As soon as we return to Arindia, she wants us to have a proper wedding. What is it about weddings that does such strange things to the female mind? Well, who can say?
Laldoran shrugged.
A woman's mind is a mystery, as you will soon discover.
Garion gave him a sour look and adjusted his crown once again.
I wish it were all over.
In time, the fanfare echoed through the hall of the Riven King. The door opened, and, trembling visibly, Garion adjusted his crown one last time and marched out to meet his fate. Although he knew most of the people in the hall, the faces around him were all a blur as he and Laldoran walked past the peat fires glowing in the pits in the floor toward the throne where his great sword once more hung in its proper place, with the orb of Aldur glowing on its pommel. The hall was hung with buntings and banners, and there was a vast profusion of spring flowers. The wedding guests in silks, satins, and brightly colored brocade seemed themselves almost like some flower garden, as they twisted and strained to watch the entrance of the royal bridegroom. Awaiting him before the throne stood the white-robed old Gorum of Ulgo, a smile on his gentle face.
"Greetings, Belgariad,"
the Gorum murmured as Garion mounted the steps.
"Holy Gorum,"
Garion replied with a nervous bow.
"Be tranquil, my son,"
the Gorum advised, noting Garion's shaking hands.
"I'm trying, Holy One."
The brazen horns sounded yet another fanfare, and the door at the back of the hall swung wide. The imperial princess Tenedra, dressed in her creamy, pearl-studded wedding gown, stood in the doorway with her cousin Zera at her side. She was stunning. Her flaming hair streamed down across one shoulder of her gown, and she wore the vari-colored golden circlet of which she had always been so fond. Her face was demure, and a delicate little blush colored her cheeks. She kept her eyes downcast, although once she flickered a quick glance at Garion, and he saw the little twinkle that lurked behind her thick lashes. He knew then, with absolute certainty, that all that demure modesty was a pose. She stood long enough to allow all to look their fill at her perfection, before, accompanied by the sound of gently cascading harps, she came down the aisle to meet her quivering bridegroom. In a ceremony that Garion thought was just a trifle overdone, Barak's two little daughters preceded the bride, strewing her path with flowers. When she reached the dais, Tenedra rather impulsively kissed the kindly old Gorum's cheek, and then took her place at Garion's side. There was a fragrance about her that was strangely flower-like, a fragrance that for some reason made Garion's knees tremble. The Gorum looked out at the assemblage and began to speak.
"We are gathered here today to witness the last unraveling of the prophecy, which has guided all our lives through the deadliest of peril and brought us safely to this happy moment. As foretold, the Riven King has returned. He has met our ancient foe, and he has prevailed. His reward stands radiant at his side."
Reward? Garion had not considered it in precisely that light before. He thought about it a bit as the Gorum continued, but it didn't really help all that much. He felt a sharp little nudge in his ribs.
"Pay attention,"
Tenedra whispered. It got down to the questions and answers shortly after that. Garion's voice cracked slightly, but that was only to be expected. Tenedra's voice, however, was clear and firm. Couldn't she at least pretend to be nervous? Just a little. The rings which they exchanged were carried on a small velvet cushion by Errand. The child took his duties quite seriously, but even on his small face there was that slightly amused look. Geryon resented that. Was everyone secretly laughing at him? The ceremony concluded with the Gurum's benediction, which Geryon did not hear. The orb of Alder, glowing with an insufferable smugness, filled his ears with its song of jubilation during the Gurum's blessing, adding its own peculiar congratulations. Tynedra had turned to him.
"Well?"
she whispered. "Well, what?" he whispered back.
"Aren't you going to kiss me?"
"Here? In front of everyone?"
"It's customary."
"It's a stupid custom."
"Just do it, Geryon,"
she said with a warm little smile of encouragement.
"We can discuss it later."
Geryon tried for a certain dignity in the kiss, a kind of chaste formality in keeping with the general tone of the occasion. Tynedra, however, would have none of that. She threw herself into the business with an enthusiasm which Geryon found slightly alarming. Her arms locked about his neck, and her lips were glued to his. He irrationally wondered just how far she intended to go with this. His knees were already beginning to buckle. The cheer which resounded through the hall saved him. The trouble with kissing in public was that one was never sure just how long one should keep it up. If it were too short, people might suspect a lack of regard. If it were too long, they might begin to snicker. Grinning rather foolishly, Belgariad of Riva turned to face the wedding guests. The wedding ball and the supper, which was part of it, immediately followed the ceremony. Chatting gaily, the wedding guests trooped through a long corridor to a brightly decorated hall, which had been converted into a grand ballroom ablaze with candles. The orchestra was composed of Rivan musicians under the direction of a fussy Arindish concertmaster, who strove mightily to keep the independent Rivans from improvising on those melodies which pleased them. This was the part Geryon had dreaded the most. The first dance was to be a solo affair featuring the royal couple. He was expected to march Tynedra to the center of the floor and perform in public. With a sudden horror, he realized, even as he and his radiant bride went to the center of the room, that he had forgotten everything Leldoran had taught him. The dance, which was popular at that particular season in the courts of the south, was a graceful and quite intricate one. The partners were to face in the same direction, the man behind and slightly to one side of the woman. Their arms were supposed to be extended, and their hands joined. Geryon managed that part without too much trouble. It was all of those quick, tiny little steps in time to the music that had him worried. In spite of everything, though, he did quite well. The fragrance of Tynedra's hair, however, continued to work on him, and he noted that his hands trembled visibly as the two of them danced. At the end of the first melody, the wedding guests applauded enthusiastically as the orchestra took up the second tune. Then they all joined in, and the floor was filled with whirling colors as the dance became general. "I guess we didn't do too badly," Geryon murmured.
"We were just fine,"
Tynedra assured him. They continued to dance.
"Geryon,"
she said after a few moments. "Yes?"
"Do you really love me?"
"Of course I do. What a silly thing to ask."
"Silly?"
"Wrong word," he amended quickly. "Sorry."
"Geryon,"
she said, after a few more measures. "Yes?"
"I love you too, you know."
"Of course I know."
"Of course? Aren't you taking a bit much for granted?"
"Why are we arguing?" he asked rather plaintively.
"We aren't arguing, Geryon,"
she told him loftily.
"We are discussing."
"Oh, well, that's all right, then." As was expected, the royal couple danced with everyone. Tynedra was passed from king to king like some royal prize, and Geryon escorted queens and ladies alike to the center of the floor for the obligatory few measures. Tiny blonde Queen Poran of Drasnia gave him excellent advice, as did the stately Queen Elena of Kerak. Plump little Queen Layla was motherly, even a bit giddy. Queen Silar gravely congratulated him, and Maya Serena of Arindia suggested that he'd dance better if he weren't quite so stiff. Barak's wife Merrill, dressed in rich green brocade, gave him the best advice of all.
You'll fight with each other, of course, she told him as they danced. But never go to sleep angry. That was always my mistake.
And finally, Geryon danced with his cousin, Adara.
Are you happy? He asked her.
More than you could ever imagine,
she replied with a gentle smile.
Then everything worked out for the best, didn't it?
Yes, Geryon. It is as if it had all been fated to happen. Everything feels so right now, somehow.
It's possible that it was fated, Geryon mused. I sometimes think we have very little control over our own lives. I know I don't. She smiled.
Very deep thoughts for a bridegroom on his wedding day.
And then her face grew gravely serious.
Don't let Zenedra drive you to distraction, she advised. And don't always give in to her.
You've heard about what's been happening?
She nodded.
Don't take it too seriously, Geryon. She's been testing you, that's all.
Are you trying to say that I still have to prove something?
With Zenedra? Probably every day. I know your little princess, Geryon. All she really wants is for you to prove that you love her, and don't be afraid to say it to her. I think you will be surprised at how agreeable she will be if you just take the trouble to tell her that you love her. Frequently.
She knows that already.
But you have to tell her.
How often do you think I ought to say it?
Oh, probably every hour or so.
He was almost certain that she was joking.
I have noticed that Sindars are a reserved sort of people, she told him. That is not going to work with Zenedra. You're going to have to put your upbringing aside and come right out and say it. It will be worth the trouble, believe me.
I'll try,
he promised. She laughed and lightly kissed his cheek.
Poor Geryon, she said.
Why poor Geryon?
You still have so much to learn.
The dance continued. Exhausted, finally, and famished by their efforts, Geryon and his bride made their way to the groaning table and sat down to take their wedding supper. The supper was quite special. 2 days before the wedding, Aunt Paul had calmly marched into the royal kitchen and had taken charge. As a result, everything was perfect. The smells from the heavily laden table were overwhelming. King Rodar absolutely could not pass by without just one more nibble. The music and the dance continued, and Geryon watched, relieved that he had escaped the floor. His eyes sought out old friends in the crowd. Barak, huge but strangely gentle, danced with Merrill, his wife. They looked very good together. Laldoran danced with Ariana, and their eyes were lost in each other's faces. Relg and Taiba did not dance, but sat together in a secluded corner. They were, Geryon noted, holding hands. Relg's expression was still slightly startled, but he did not look unhappy. Near the center of the floor, Hetar and Adara danced with the innate grace of those who spend their lives on horseback. Hetar's hawk-like face was different somehow, and Adara was flushed with happiness. Geryon decided that it might be a good time to try Adara's advice. He leaned toward Zenedra's pink little ear and cleared his throat.
"I love you,"
he whispered. It was difficult the first time, so he tried it again, just to get the feel of it.
"I love you,"
he whispered again. It was easier the second time. The effect on his princess was electrifying. She blushed a sudden rosy red, and her eyes went very wide and somehow defenseless. Her entire heart seemed to be in those eyes. She appeared unable to speak, but reached out instead gently to touch his face. As he returned her gaze, he was quite amazed at the change that simple phrase had made in her. Adara, it appeared, had been right. He stored that bit of information away rather carefully, feeling more confident than he had in months. The hall was filled with colors as the guests danced in celebration of the royal wedding. There were, however, a few faces that did not reflect the general happiness. Near the center of the floor, Mandoralan danced with the Lady Nerina, Baroness of Voebor, and their faces mirrored that tragedy which was still central to their lives. Not far from them, Silk danced with Queen Porin. The little man's face bore once again that same bitter, self-mocking expression Geryon had first seen in King Anheg's palace at Valalorn. Geryon sighed.
"Melancholy already, my husband?"
Tinedra asked him with a little twinkle. Once again, even as they sat, she ducked her head beneath his arm and drew it about her in that peculiar way of hers. Oh, she smelled very good, and he noted that she was very soft and warm. "I was just remembering a few things," he replied to her question.
"Good. Try to get all of that out of the way now. I wouldn't want it interfering later."
Geryon's face turned bright red, and Tinedra laughed a wicked little laugh.
"I think that perhaps later is not much further off," she said then. "You must dance with Lady Belgariad, and I'll dance with your grandfather, and then I think it will be time for us to retire. It has been a very full day."
"I am a bit tired," Geryon agreed.
"Oh, your day is not over yet, Belgariad of Riva,"
she told him pointedly. Feeling a bit peculiar about it, Geryon approached Aunt Paul where she and Durnick sat watching the dance. "Will you dance with me, Aunt Belgariad?" he asked with a formal little bow. She looked at him a bit quizzically. "So, you have finally admitted it." "Admitted what?" "Who I really am. I've known. But you have never called me by my full name before, Geryon," she pointed out, rising and gently smoothing back his hair. "I think it might be a rather significant step." They danced together in the glowing candlelight to the music of lutes and pipes. Polgra's steps were more measured and slow than the dance Leldarin had so painstakingly taught to Geryon. She had reached back, Geryon realized, into the dim past, and she led him through the stately measures of a dance she had learned centuries before, during her sojourn with the Wasait Errands. Together they moved through the slow, graceful, and somehow melancholy measures of a dance which had vanished forever some 25 centuries before, to live on only in Belgariad's memory. Tinedra was blushing furiously when Belgariad returned her to Geryon for their last dance. The old man grinned impishly, bowed to his daughter, and took her hands to lead her as well. The four of them danced not far from each other, and Geryon clearly heard his aunt's question. "Have we done well, father?" Belgariad's smile was quite genuine.
"Why, yes, Belgariad. As a matter of fact, I think we have done very well indeed."
"Then it was all worth it, wasn't it, father?"
"Yes, Paul, it really was."
They danced on.
"What did he say to you?"
Geryon whispered to Tinedra. She blushed.
"Never mind. Maybe I would tell you later."
There was that word again. The dance ended, and an expectant hush fell over the crowd. Tinedra went to her father, kissed him lightly, and then returned.
"Well?"
she said to Geryon. "Well, what?" She laughed.
"Oh, you're impossible."
And then she took his hand and very firmly led him from the hall. It was quite late, perhaps 2 hours past midnight. Belgariad the sorcerer was in a whimsical mood as he wandered about the deserted halls of the Riven Citadel with a tankard in his hand. Belgariad had done a bit of celebrating, and he was feeling decidedly mellow, though not nearly as much as many of the other wedding guests who had already mellowed themselves into insensibility. The old man stopped once to examine a guard who was snoring in a doorway, sprawled in a puddle of spilled ale. Then, humming rather tunelessly, and adding a couple of skipping little dance steps as he proceeded down the hall, the white-bearded old sorcerer made his way in the general direction of the ballroom, where he was certain there was a bit of ale left. As he passed the hall of the Raven King, he noted that the door was ajar, and that there was a light inside. Curious, he stuck his head through the doorway to see if anyone might be about. The hall was deserted, and the light infusing it came from the orb of Aldur, resting on the pommel of the sword of the Raven King.
"Oh," Belgariad said to the stone, "it's you."
Then the old man walked a trifle unsteadily down the aisle to the foot of the dais.
"Well, old friend," he said, squinting up at the orb, "I see they have all gone off and left you alone too."
The orb flickered its recognition of him. Belgariad sat down heavily on the edge of the dais and took a drink of ale.
"We have come a long way together, haven't we?"
he said to the orb in a conversational tone. The orb ignored him.
"I wish you weren't so serious about things all of the time. You are a very stodgy companion."
The old man took another drink. They were silent for a while, and Belgariad pulled off one of his boots, sighed, and wriggled his toes contentedly.
"You really don't understand any of this, do you, my friend?" he asked the orb finally. "In spite of everything, you still have the soul of a stone. You understand hate and loyalty and unswerving commitment, but you can't comprehend the more human feelings. Compassion, friendship, love. Love, most of all, I think. Sort of a shame that you don't understand, really. Because those were the things that finally decided all of this. Oh, yes, they've been mixed up in it from the very beginning. But then you wouldn't know about that, would you?"
The orb continued to ignore him, its attention obviously elsewhere.
"What are you concentrating on so hard?"
the old man asked curiously. The orb, which had glowed with a bright blue radiance, flickered again, and its blue became suddenly infused with a pale pink, which steadily grew more and more pronounced until the stone was actually blushing. Belgariad cast one twinkling glance in the general direction of the royal apartment.
"Oh,"
he said, understanding, and then he began to chuckle. The orb blushed even brighter. Belgariad laughed, pulled his boot back on, and rose unsteadily to his feet.
"Perhaps you understand more than I thought you did,"
he said to the stone. He drained the last few drops from the tankard.
"I'd really like to stay and discuss it, but have run out of ale. I'm sure you'll excuse me."
And then he went back up the broad aisle. When he reached the doorway, he stopped and cast one amused glance back at the still furiously blushing orb. Then he chuckled again and went out, quietly closing the door behind him. Thus concludes the Belgariad, which began with Pawn of Prophecy. And while history, unlike mortal pen, does not cease, the records beyond this point remain as yet unrevealed.